History of the World Crisis. Lecture 1. The World Crisis and the Peruvian Proletariat. By J. C. Mariategua. Translated by Juan Arfa-Yardo, 1998. Delivered to the González Prada People's University. At the Peruvian Student Federation Hall, Lima, on June 15, 1923. In this lecture, let us call it conversation rather than lecture, will limit myself to laying out the course's program, as well as some thoughts on the need to spread knowledge of world crisis among the proletariat. Unfortunately, in Peru there is a lack of an educating press which will follow the development of this great crisis with attentiveness, intelligence, and an ideological filiation. Likewise, there is a lack of university professors, of José Ingeniero's kind, capable of being passionate about the ideas of renovation which are currently changing the world, and of freeing themselves from the influence and prejudices of a conservative and bourgeois culture and education. There is a lack of socialist and syndicalist groups, in possession of their own instruments of popular culture, and thus capable of making the people interested in studying the crisis. The only popular educational institution, with the revolutionary spirit, is this institution in formation, the People's University. It thus falls to it, beyond the modest plane of its initial work, to present contemporary reality to the people, explain to the people that it is living through one of the greatest and most transcendental times in history, and infect the people with the fruitful restlessness which currently moves the other civilized peoples of the world. In this great contemporary crisis, the proletariat is not a spectator, it is an actor. In it the fate of the world proletariat is to be resolved. From it will emerge, according to all odds and predictions, the proletarian civilization, the socialist civilization, destined to succeed the declining, decadent, moribund capitalist, individualist, and bourgeois civilization. The proletariat needs, now more than ever, to know what happens in the world. It cannot know it by way of the fragmented, occasional, homeopathic reports of the daily cable, badly translated, and worse written, in most instances coming always from reactionary agencies charged with discrediting the revolution's parties, organizations, and men, and of discouraging and disorienting the world proletariat. In the European crisis, the destinies of the workers of the world are in play. The crisis development should thus interest Peruvian workers and the workers of the Far East alike. The crisis has Europe as its primary theater, but the crisis of European institutions is the crisis of the institutions of Western civilization. And Peru, like the other countries of the Americas, moves within the orbit of that civilization, not only because we are dealing with countries which are politically independent but economically colonial, tied to cart of British, or American, or French, capitalism, but also because our culture is European, and European is the type of our institutions. And it is precisely these democratic institutions which we copied from Europe, this culture which we also copied from Europe, which in Europe are now in a period of definitive, total, crisis. Above all, capitalist society has internationalized humanity's life, it has forged material bonds between all the peoples which establish between them an inevitable solidarity. Internationalism is not an ideal, it is a historical reality. Progress causes the interests, the ideas, the customs, the regimes of the peoples to become united and mingled. Peru, like other American countries, is therefore not outside the crisis, it is within it. The world crisis has already echoed amongst these peoples, and, of course, it shall continue to echo. A period of reaction in Europe will also be a period of reaction in America. A period of revolution in Europe will also be a period of revolution in America. Over a century ago, when humanity's life was not as solidarious as it is today, when there did not exist the means of communication which exist today, when nations did not have the immediate and constant contact they have today, and when we were but distant spectators to European events, the French Revolution gave birth to the War of Independence and the emergence of these republics. This memory is enough for us to realize the speed with which the transformation of society shall be reflected in American societies. Those who say that Peru, and America in general, live far removed from the European Revolution, have no notion of contemporary life, have not even an approximate understanding of history. These people are surprised that Europe's most advanced ideals should make it to Peru, but, by contrast, they are not surprised that the airplane, the ocean liner, the wireless telegraph, the radio, in short, all the most advanced expressions of Europe's material advance make it. There would be the same reason for ignoring the socialist movement as there would be for ignoring Einstein's theory of relativity. I am sure that it would not occur to the most reactionary of our intellectuals, almost all are impenetrable reactionaries, that the new physics, of which Einstein is the most eminent and the greatest representative, ought to be banned from study and dissemination. If the proletariat in general needs to learn about the great aspects of the world crisis, this need is even greater in that part of the proletariat, socialist, laborite, syndicalist, or libertarian, which makes up its vanguard, in that more combative and more conscious, more fighting and more prepared, part of the proletariat, in that part of the proletariat which is in charge of the leadership of the great proletarian actions, in that part of the proletariat to which falls the historical role of representing the Peruvian proletariat in the present social moment, in short, in that part of the proletariat which, whatever its particular credo, has class consciousness, has revolutionary consciousness. I dedicate my dissertations, above all, to this vanguard of the Peruvian proletariat. No one needs to study the world crisis more than the vanguard proletarians. I have no pretensions of coming to this free rostrum, of a free university, to teach them the history of that world crisis, but to myself study it with them. I do not teach you from this grandstand, comrades, the history of the world crisis, I study it with you. I have, in this study, but the very modest merit of bringing to it personal observations from 3½ years of European living, in other words, of the 3½ climactic years of the crisis, and the echoes of contemporary European thinking. I specially invite the vanguard of the proletariat to study with me the process of the world crisis, for several very important reasons. These I will briefly enumerate. The first reason is that the revolutionary preparation, the revolutionary culture, and the revolutionary orientation of that proletarian vanguard have been formed on the basis of the socialist, syndicalist, and anarchist literature from before the European War, or prior, at least, to the climactic period of the crisis. Generally, it is outdated socialist, syndicalist, and libertarian books which circulate among us. Here a little is known of the classic literature of socialism and of syndicalism, the new revolutionary literature is unknown. Revolutionary culture here is a classical culture, aside from being, as you well know, comrades, a new, very unformed, very disorganized, very incomplete culture. Now, all that pre-war socialist and syndicalist literature is being revised. And that revision is not one imposed by the whim of theoreticians, but by the force of events. That literature, therefore, cannot be used without the benefit of an inventory. Naturally, it is not that it is no longer exact in its principles, in all that ideal and eternal that there is in it, but that it has often ceased to be exact in its tactical inspirations, in its historical considerations, in all that means action, procedure, means of struggle. The worker's goal remains the same. What have necessarily changed, due to the latest historical events, are the roads chosen to arrive at, even just approach, that ideal goal. It is from this that the study of these historical events and of their significance becomes indispensable to workers who are militants in class-conscious organizations. Comrades, you know that the European proletarian forces are divided into two great camps, reformists and revolutionaries. There is a reformist, collaborationist, evolutionist Workers' International, and another maximalist, anti-collaborationist, Revolutionary Workers' International. Between the one and the other, there has attempted to emerge an intermediate international. But it has ended up by making common cause with the former against the latter. In one and the other sides there are various hues, but the sides are clearly and unmistakably but two. The side of those who wish to bring about socialism by collaborating politically with the bourgeoisie, and the side of those who seek to bring about socialism by seizing political power entirely for the proletariat. Of course, the existence of these two sides comes from the existence of two different views, two opposed views, two antithetical views, on the current historical moment. One part of the proletariat believes that the moment is not a revolutionary one, that the bourgeoisie has not yet played out its historical role, that, on the contrary, the bourgeoisie is still strong enough to hold on to political power, that, in short, the hour of social revolution has not yet arrived. Another part of the proletariat believes that the current historical moment is revolutionary, that the bourgeoisie is incapable of rebuilding the social wealth destroyed by the war, and incapable, therefore, of solving the problems of peace, that the war has brought about a crisis whose solution cannot be but a proletarian solution, a socialist solution, and, that, with the Russian Revolution, the social revolution has begun. There are, then, two proletarian armies because there are within the proletariat two opposing views of the historical moment, two different interpretations of the world crisis. The numerical strength of one or the other of the proletarian armies is dependent on whether or not events appear to confirm its respective historical view. It is because of this, that thinkers, theoreticians, studious men of one and the other proletarian armies struggle above all to delve deeply into the meaning of the crisis, to understand its character, to discover its significance. Before the war, two tendencies split up predominance among the proletariat, the socialist tendency, and the syndicalist tendency. The socialist tendency was, mostly, reformist, social democratic, collaborationist. The socialists thought that social revolution's hour was far off, and fought for gradual conquest through legalistic action and governmental, or at least, legislative, collaboration. In some countries this activity excessively weakened the revolutionary will and spirit of socialism. Socialism was considerably bourgeoisified. As a reaction against this bourgeoisification of socialism, we had syndicalism. Syndicalism countered the political activity of the socialist parties with the direct action of the unions. The proletariat's most revolutionary and intransigent spirits found refuge within syndicalism. But, deep down, syndicalism also turned out to be collaborationist and reformistic. Syndicalism also was dominated by a union bureaucracy lacking a true revolutionary psychology. And, syndicalism and socialism showed themselves to be conjoined in some countries, such as Italy, where the Socialist Party did not take part in the government and remained loyal to other formal principles of independence. Such as it is, the more or less contending, or depending on the country more or less close, tendencies were two, syndicalist and socialist. It is to this period of social struggle that the revolutionary literature which has fed the mentality of our leading proletarians belongs. But, the situation has changed after the war. The proletarian camp, as we have just recalled, is no longer divided into socialists and syndicalists, but into reformists and revolutionaries. First, we have witnessed a schism, a split, in the socialists' camp. One part of socialism has held fast in its social democratic, collaborationist, course, the other part has followed an anti-collaborationist, revolutionary, course. And, it is this part of socialism which, in order to set itself apart from the former, has adopted the name of communism. The split has also taken place in the same way in the syndicalist camp. One part of the union supports the Social Democrats, and the other supports the communists. The outlook of European social struggle has, therefore, shifted radically. We have seen many intransigent pre-war syndicalists head toward reformism. We have, by contrast, seen others follow communism. And, among these, as I recalled to Comrade Fonkin in a conversation not long ago, can be counted the greatest and most illustrious theorist of syndicalism, the Frenchman, Georges Sorel. Sorel, whose death has been a bitter mourning for the French proletariat and intelligentsia, gave all his adherence to the Russian Revolution and to the men of the Russian Revolution. Thus, here, as in Europe, the proletarians have to divide, not into syndicalists and socialists, an anachronistic classification, but into collaborationists and anti-collaborationists, into reformists and maximalists. But, in order that for this classification to take place clearly, coherently, it is indispensable that the proletariat know and understand the great contemporary crisis in its broad features. Otherwise, confusion is inevitable. I hold to the opinion of those who believe that humanity is living through a revolutionary period. I am convinced of the approaching decline of all social democratic theses, of reformist theses, of all evolutionist theses. Before the war, these theses were understandable, because they corresponded to different historical conditions. Capitalism was in its apogee. Production was superabundant. Capitalism could still allow itself the luxury of making successive economic concessions to the proletariat. Its margins of utility were such that the formation of a middle class, of a petty bourgeoisie which enjoyed a comfortable lifestyle, was possible. The European laborer earned enough to eat discreetly, and in some countries, such as England and Germany, he could satisfy some spiritual needs. There was not, then, an atmosphere for revolution. After the war, everything has changed. Europe's social wealth has, in great measure, been destroyed. Capitalism, responsible for the war, need to rebuild that wealth at the expense of the proletariat. It, therefore, wants socialists to collaborate in the government, in order to strengthen democratic institutions, not in order to make progress down the road of socialist fulfillments. Previously, socialists collaborated in order to gradually improve the workers' living conditions. Today they would collaborate in order to renounce all proletarian conquest. In order to rebuild Europe, the bourgeoisie requires that the proletariat agree to produce more and consume less. And, the proletariat objects to one thing and the other and says to itself that it is not worthwhile to consolidate in power a class that is guilty of the war and destined, fatally, to lead humanity to an even crueler war. The conditions for a collaboration by the bourgeoisie with the proletariat are, by nature, such that collaborationism must necessarily, bit by bit, lose its current numerous proselytism. Capitalism cannot make concessions to socialism. In order to rebuild themselves, European states require a regimen of rigorous fiscal economy, increase in work hours, lowering of salaries, in short, the re-establishment of economic concepts and methods abolished in homage to proletarian will. Logically, the proletariat cannot consent to this reversal. It cannot, nor do it wish to, consent to it. All possibility of rebuilding the capitalist economy is thus eliminated. This is the tragedy of today's Europe. In the European countries, the reaction is cancelling the economic concessions made to socialism, but, while on the one hand this reactionary policy cannot be sufficiently energetic and effective as to re-establish the bled-dry public wealth, on the other, the proletariat's united front is preparing itself, slowly, against that reactionary policy. Fearful of revolution, the reaction thus cancels, not only the masses' economic conquests, but moves also against political conquests. Thus, in Italy, we bear witness to the fascist dictatorship. But the bourgeoisie thus undercuts and saps and mortally wounds democratic institutions. It loses all of its moral strength and all its ideological prestige. Moreover, in international relations, the reaction places foreign policy in the hands of nationalist and anti-democratic minorities. These nationalist minorities saturate that foreign policy with chauvinism. With their imperialist leanings, and their fight for European hegemony, they block the re-establishment of an atmosphere of European solidarity which would allow states to agree on a program of cooperation and work. The work of that nationalism, of that reactionism, is evident in the occupation of the Ruhr. The world crisis is, then, an economic and a political crisis. And, it is also, above all, an ideological crisis. The affirmative, positivist, philosophies of bourgeois society are, since long ago, undermined by a current of skepticism, of relativism. Rationalism, historicism, positivism, irremediably decline. This is undoubtedly the deepest aspect, the gravest symptom, of the crisis. This is the most definite and deepest indication that what is in crisis is not only bourgeois society's economy, but is capitalist civilization, Western civilization, European civilization in its entirety. Well, now. The ideologues of social revolution, Marx and Bakunin, Engels and Kropotkin, lived at the time of the height of capitalist civilization and of historicist and positivist philosophy. Consequently, they could not foresee that the ascendancy of the proletariat had to occur by virtue of the decadence of Western civilization. The proletariat was destined to create a new type of civilization and culture. The economic ruin of the bourgeoisie was also to be the ruin of bourgeois civilization. And, socialism would find itself with the need to govern, not in a time of plenty, but in a time of poverty, misery, and scarcity. Reformist socialists, accustomed to the notion that the socialist order, more than a mode of production, is a mode of distribution, believe they see in this the sign that the historic mission of the bourgeoisie is not yet played out and that time is not ripe for the realization of socialism. In a report for La Cronica I recalled those phrases to the effect that the tragedy of Europe is the following: capitalism no longer can, and socialism cannot yet. This phrase, which does in fact give one a sense of the tragedy of Europe, is a reformist's phrase. It is a phrase saturated with evolutionist mentality, and impregnated with the notion of a slow, gradual, and beatific movement, without convulsions nor tremors, from individualist society to collectivist society. History teaches us that every new social state has taken shape on the ruins on the preceding social state, and that between the emergence of one and the downfall of the other, there has, logically, been an intervening period of crisis. We are witnessing the disintegration, the agony of a worn-out, senile, decrepit society, and, at the same time, we are witnessing the slow and restless gestation, the formation, the creation, of the new society. All men, for whom a sincere ideological filiation binds to the new society and separates us from the old, must profoundly fix our gaze on this, agitated and intense, transcendental period in human history. History of the World Crisis. Lecture 2. War Literature. By J.C. Mariategua. Translated by Juan Arfa Yardo, 1998. Delivered to the González Prada People's University. At the Peruvian Student Federation Hall, Lima, on June 23, 1923. Author's Notes. War Literature. The press, martial instrument. Its toxic function. Its quality of capitalist instrument. Its lack of high moral directions. The myth of civilizations against barbarism. The novel ends, history begins, said Bernard Shaw. In tempo de guerra piu bugi chatera. Economic causes of the war, development of British industrialism and the development of German industrialism. The economic war between England and Germany. The struggle for markets, for colonies. Effects of protectionism in the European countries' economies. The role of international finance. Capitalist groups' rivalries. Then, how a policy of economic cooperation and solidarity could have avoided the catastrophe. Demography has an important place in the origins of the war. Adrian Tilger's words, page 106 of The World Crisis. In 1 century the European population went from 180 to 450 millions. Industrialism stimulated population growth. Reduction in the 3 causes of depopulation: plague, hunger, war. Germany, cut off, could not feed 70 million inhabitants. Italy could not remain neutral. Political causes, the process of the war's causes, according to Bernard Shaw. The traditional policy and position of England, an island power. The development of Germany's naval power. England, France, and Belgium have an understanding. The Franco-Russian alliance. Anglo-French secret military intelligence. The violation of Belgian neutrality saved England from embarrassment. but there is information and antecedents which establish the type of agreement which exists between England and France. If England had truly wished to avoid the war, says Shaw, it would have needed only to announce that it would fight alongside the nation which was attacked. The hypothesis of a noose, of a trap. More believable is the hypothesis of the impossibility of the English government's revealing its military agreement with France. Thus, from this point of view, the war turns out to be a consequence of French diplomacy. Another cause, French revanchism, German Deutschland über alles. European nationalism, in short. Psychology of the French petty bourgeoisie and of the German bureaucracy. Germany felt dispossessed next to the privileged nations. Poincaré. The Kaiser. The Tsar. Lloyd George's words in the British Parliament, page 39 of Kellyas's book. Another cause, armed peace. The powers balance. There existed in Europe a flammable atmosphere. The diplomatic cause, the assassination of the Austrian heir. The war could have broken out earlier. In the instance of the Russo-Japanese War and of the Agadir incident of 1912. Words from Viviani to Rappaport, page 33 of the latter's book. Contrast of capitalist organization. It needs international solidarity as a condition of life and promotes nationalism in opposition to class struggle. How a people is moved to war. The novel, Clart. Absolute war and relative war. War of nations and war of armies. The myth of democratic war. The direction of public opinion in England, in Italy, Austria, and Russia, insofar as there was no ideal which could unite the people behind their respective governments' military enterprises. The behavior of the socialist parties and of the syndicalist organizations. The Second International's position. The Stuttgart and Basel declarations. The technical issue of how to avoid the war was left to the Vienna Congress, which was to meet in 1914. Before then, the war arrived. Müller's mission in France. The death of Jor. Gustave Hervé's case. Above the conflict. The manifesto of 93 German intellectuals. The counter-manifesto by Nicolai, the physiologist, by Einstein, the physicist, by Buch, the philosopher, by Forster, the astronomer, the latter surprised by the 93 intellectuals. Romain Rolland. Let the proletariat meditate over the causes of this great tragedy. Let it think about how a few men and few interests have been able to unleash a war which has caused 15 million deaths, which sown Europe with hatreds, which has destroyed so much economic wealth, and which has deleteriously poisoned the moral atmosphere of Europe. And, let the proletariat tell itself if it is worthwhile to rebuild capitalist society, bourgeois society, so that in 40 or 50 years, perhaps sooner, the world will again be lit up in another conflagration and another butchery take place. History of the World Crisis. Lecture 3. The Failure of the Second International. By J.C. Mariategua. Translated by Juan Arfa Yardo, 1998. Delivered to the González Prada People's University. At the Peruvian Student Federation Hall, Lima, on June 30, 1923. Author's notes. I will not omit presentation of the anarchist movement. I will not bring in any sectarian spirit. I think it is opportune for me to confirm myself in these declarations. Some comrades fear that I may be a bit partial and a bit non-objective in my course. But I am a partisan, above all, of the Proletarian United Front. We must make many long marches together. Common cause against collaborationism. Rather than grouping workers into sects or parties, group them into a single federation. Let each one have own affiliation, but all, the common class-conscious credo. Let us together study the present's exciting hours. We shall complete the examination of the behavior of the socialist parties and the unions. We shall see how and why the proletariat was powerless to prevent the conflagration. The war caught the Second International unprepared. There was not yet a concrete and practical action program for ensuring peace. Stuttgart Congress. Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg's motion. In case war should break out, it is the socialists' duty to intervene for its speedy termination and to strive with all their power to utilize the economic and political crisis created by the war to rouse the masses and thereby hasten the downfall of capitalist domination. But, in the Second International there were few Lenins and Rosa Luxemburgs. 3 years later, the Copenhagen Congress. Vaillant and Keir Hardie proposed a general strike. The technical issue was left for Vienna, 1914. In 1912 the grave situation forced the two international to convene an extraordinary Congress. Basel 1912 November. From this Congress came a manifesto. And again the technical issue was left for Vienna, August 1914. Earlier, Sarajevo. The Brussels International Bureau urgently convened the European Socialist parties on July 29. For France, Jors, Vaillant, Guesde, Longuet. For Germany, Hasse, Rosa Luxemburg. Rush the Congress. Paris, August 9, instead of Vienna, August 23. International Offices Declaration. Jors' words on the night of July 29. 2 days later Jors dead. Müller in Paris, the 1st of August. Fruitlessness of his mission. The already uncontainable war broke out. The August 9 Congress could not take place. The pages of Claridad vividly describe the delirious patriotism and nationalism. The majority obfuscated, infected with the warmongering, martial, aggressive atmosphere. The press and intellectuals instigators. Why couldn't the International put up a barrier against this flood of nationalist passion? Why couldn't the International remain loyal to principles of class-conscious solidarity? Let us look at the circumstances which dictated socialist conduct. German deputies' declaration in Parliament on August 4. 14 votes, against. French socialists' declaration in Parliament on August 6. In France, an attacked nation, the adherence was more ardorous, more intense. The attitude of the other workers' parties. From the Second to the Third International. The Italian socialists' conduct calls for special mention. They showed the greatest loyalty to internationalism. July 26, Socialist Manifesto. Struggle between neutralists and interventionism. Interventionism socialist abettors. Arturo Labriola * Benito Mussolini. Anecdote about both. Italian socialists' formula, neither join the war nor sabotage it. Socialist declaration in the chamber. The Zimmerwald meeting in September of 1915. German, French, Italian, Russian, Polish, Balkan, Swedish, Norwegian, Dutch, and Swiss delegations attended. England denied passports. Lenin. The Zimmerwald Manifesto, first awakening of proletarian consciousness. But this call did not resonate in all proletarian consciences. The loyal, in a minority. The Sacred Union. The National United Front. Truce in the class struggle. A single party, that of national defense. To make sure of the proletariat, the bourgeoisie gave it participation in power. Some concession to the minimum program. The war demanded the greatest possible national discipline. Liberties restricted. This policy seemed the inauguration of the socialist era. Revolutionary War. The state supported the combatants' families, offered bread at a low price, and greatly subsidized industry. Abundant well-remunerated work. With this the notion of social injustice was deadened in the masses, the reasons for class struggle were attenuated. The proletariat did not notice that this prodigality of the state built up burdens for the future. After the war, the defeated would pay. Let the people fight to the end. It was necessary to win. The Allies, more than predication of interests, predication of ideals. The English people, believed it fought in defense of weaker peoples. The French people, against barbarism, autocracy, medievalism. Hate of quarrelsomeness. The Allies' strength consisted precisely of these myths. For the Austro-Germans, a military war. For the Allies, a holy war, a crusade for great and sacred human ideals. The leaders, for the most part, gave their assent to this propaganda. Effective adherence by a large part of the proletariat. It was not only the bourgeois politicians who spoke. In Austria and Germany the adherence was less strong. War of national defense. Stronger pacifist minorities. Liebknecht, etc., had more room. Germany surrounded by enemies. Sense of victory. Victory in the name of national defense and hope. Germany had sufficient arguments. All these circumstances led to European proletarians murdering one another for 4 years. Thusly, the Second International failed. Experience shows that, within this social order, wars are not inevitable. Capitalist democracy, armed peace, policy of equilibrium, secret diplomacy. War is constantly incubated. And, the proletariat can do nothing. Now, the experience of the Franco-German conflict. Too many nationalist interests and sentiments still carry weight. In line with these hard lessons, the cry of down with war, the cry of the Two International, of all its congresses, even of the Wilson-type pacifists is not enough. The proletariat's cry, Viva Proletarian Society. Let us think of building it. Jore's great phrase must not be far from our thoughts. We must stop the specter of war from emerging from its grave every 6 months to terrorize the world. History of the World Crisis. Lecture 4. Italy's Intervention in the War. By J.C. Mariategua. Translated by Juan R. Fajardo, 1998. Delivered to the González Prada People's University. At the Peruvian Student Federation Hall, Lima, on July 16, 1923. During my lectures I do not forget that this course is, above all, a people's course, a popularization course. I try to always use simple and clear language, and not complicated and technical language. But, with everything, in speaking about political, economic, social topics one cannot dispense with certain terms which perhaps may not be understandable to all. I use technical terminology the least I can, but in many cases I have to use it, albeit always with parsimony. My wish is that this class shall be accessible not only to the initiated in social sciences and economic sciences, but to all workers with an attentive and studious spirit. Therefore, when I use an obscure lexicon, when I use terms unusual in the vernacular, I do so with great moderation. And I try that these periods of my lessons turn out to be, in the worst of cases, transitory parentheses, the understanding of which not be indispensable for following and taking in the course's general ideas. I think this foreword is useful, on the one hand, so that those initiated into the social and economic sciences understand why, in many cases, I do not resort to technical terminology which would allow greater conciseness in the presentation of ideas and in commenting upon phenomena, and, on the other hand, why, despite my will, I cannot in many cases use popular and basic language. I must also remind the uninitiated that these are courses and not a speech. Perforce they must sometimes seem a bit dry. In previous lectures, first in examining the mentality of both belligerent groups, and then, in examining the conduct of the socialist parties and syndical organizations, we established the character of the World War. We have seen why its most profound commentators have called it total war. Total war, that is, war of nations, war of peoples, and not war of armies. Adrian Tilger reaches the following conclusion: total war has been defeated by those governments which knew how to carry it out with the proper mentality, giving it ends capable of becoming myths, emotional states, passions, and popular feelings. In this regard, no one has contributed to strengthening the countries of the Entente in the unshakable belief in the justness of their cause and in the aim of continuing the war until final victory, than Wilson, with his Quaker democratic preaching. On the other hand, he who has carried out total war with a mentality of diplomatic or relative war has been defeated, Russia, Austria, Germany, or has greatly risked being so, Italy. This conclusion by Adrian Tilger defines very well the principal meaning of the United States intervention, as well as the physiognomy of the Italian War. Because of this, to me it has seemed opportune to cite it upon beginning tonight's class, in which we will, to begin with, deal with the Italian intervention and the North American intervention. Italy intervened in the war more due to economic reasons than due to diplomatic and political reasons. Its soil did not permit it to feed but barely 2/3 of its population with its own agricultural produce. Italy had to import wheat and other products indispensable to 1/3 of its population, and at the same time, had to export manufactured goods, the merchandise, the products of its labor and its industry, in sufficient proportion so as to pay for that wheat and for those foodstuffs and raw materials which it lacked. Consequently, Italy was at the mercy, as it is today as well, of the power which held dominion over the seas. In short, its imports and its exports, indispensable to its life, depended on England. Italy lacked freedom of action. Its neutrality was impossible. Italy could not, like Switzerland, like Holland, be a spectator to the war. Its role in European politics was too great for it not to be dragged along once a continental war broke out. Not having placed itself on the side of the Austro-Hungarians, it was inevitable that Italy place itself on the side of the Allies. Italy was truly a prisoner of the Allied nations. These circumstances led Italy to intervention. The diplomatic reasons were comparatively fewer. They probably would not have sufficed to force Italy into intervention. But they sufficed, of course, for interventionist elements to create a public opinion current favorable toward war. In Italy, the interventionist elements were of two kinds. The ones were inspired by nationalist and revanchist ideals, and saw in the war the occasion to bring the unrecovered territories of Trent and Trieste back into the Italian nation. Further, they saw in the war an easy and glorious military adventure destined to enlarge Italy's position in Europe and the world. The other interventionist elements were inspired by democratic ideals, analogous to those later sponsored by Wilson, and saw in the war a crusade against Prussian militarism and for people's liberty. The Italian government kept the ideals of the nationalists in mind when it arranged for Italy's intervention in the war. A secret pact was signed in London between the Allies and Italy. This pact, this notorious London Pact, later published by the Bolsheviks, established that part which Italy would receive from the fruits of victory. This pact, in short, lessened Italy's entry into the war. Italy did not intervene in the war in the name of a great ideal, nor in the name of a great myth, but in the name of a national interest. But that was the hidden truth of things. The official truth was another. According to the official truth, Italy fought for the freedom of weak peoples, etc. In short, for internal use the reasons of the democratic interventionists were adopted, and the fundamental reason was kept quiet, the need in which Italy was in, or found itself in, of intervening in the contest out of the impossibility of remaining neutral. That is why Adrian Tilger says that, in the beginning, the Italian war was conducted with a mentality of relative war, of diplomatic war. The consequences of this policy soon made themselves felt. During the first phase of the Italian war, there was in Italy a strong pro-neutrality current of public opinion. The socialists were not the only ones averse to the war. So were the Gioliti and his partisans, that is, a large bourgeois group. It was the existence of just this pro-neutrality nucleus of bourgeois opinion which allowed the socialists to act with greater freedom, with greater efficacy, within a less asphyxiatingly belligerent martial atmosphere than socialists of the other warring countries. The socialists took advantage of this division in the bourgeois front to affirm the pacifist desires of the proletariat. The sacred union, the fusion of all the parties into one, the National Defense Party, was not complete in Italy. The Italian people did not perceive the war unanimously. More than any military cause, it was these political causes, these psychological causes, which caused the defeat at Caporetto, the Italian troops' disastrous retreat before the Austro-Hungarian offensive. We have the proof of this in the second phase of the Italian War. After Caporetto, there was a reaction in politics, in Italian public opinion. The people began to truly feel the need to commit all its resources to the war. The Giolittian neutralists joined the Sacred Union. From that moment on, it was no longer just the Italian army, backed by an interventionist government and an interventionist public opinion current, which fought against the Austro-Germans. For Italy, the war ceased to be a relative war. It started to be total war. Superficial commentators attributed the Caporetto defeat to exclusively military causes. They then attributed military causes to the Italian reaction as well. They over-exaggerated the importance of the troops and the military resources sent from France to the Italian front. But the objective and documented history of the Italian war shows that these reinforcements were, in fact, very limited and, more than to numerically strengthen the Italian army, were meant to strengthen it morally. Indeed, it turns out that Italy, in exchange for the French reinforcements it received, sent some Italian reinforcements to France. There was an exchange of troops between the Italian front and the French front. All this was of secondary importance in the reorganization of the Italian front. The Italian reaction was not a military reaction, it was a moral reaction, a political reaction. While the Italian political front was weak, the military front was weak as well. Once the political front began being strong, so too did the military front begin to be strong. Because, in this aspect of the World War, as in its other great aspects, the political factors, the moral factors, the psychological factors, had greater importance than the military factors. We find confirmation of this thesis in examining the efficacy of the American intervention. The United States did not only contribute a valuable moral and political confluence to the Allies. Wilson's speeches and proclamations weakened the German front more than the North American soldiers and more than the American, that is, North American war material. So say the documents of the German defeat. Such is established by several authoritative books, from among which I will point out Francisco Nitti's book, Europe Without Peace, as it is one of the better known. Wilson's speeches and proclamations deeply undermined the Austro-German front. Wilson spoke of the German people as of a fraternal people. Wilson said, "We do not wage war against the German people, but against Prussian militarism." Wilson promised the German people a peace without annexations nor indemnizations. This propaganda, which resounded the world over, creating a large volume of opinion favorable to the Allied cause, resounded in Germany and Austria as well. The German people felt that the war was no longer a war of national defense. Naturally, Austria was moved much more than Germany by the Wilsonian propaganda. In Bohemia, in Hungary, in all the peoples brought into the Austro-Hungarian Empire by force, the Wilsonian propaganda stimulated the old ideals of national independence. The effects of this weakening of the German political front and of the Austrian political front necessarily had to become evident following the first military loss. And so it was. While the German government and the Austrian government could keep the hope of victory alive, they were also able to keep their people's allegiance in the war. As soon as that hope began to disappear, things changed. The German government and the Austrian government lost control of the masses, undermined by Wilsonian propaganda. The Italians' offensive in the Piave encountered an enemy little disposed to fight to the end. Entire divisions of Czechoslovaks capitulated. The Austrian front came undone. This military and moral disaster immediately resounded in the German front. The German front was, the vigorous German offensive notwithstanding, militarily intact. But, the German front was, instead, politically and morally broken and ready to yield. There are documents which describe Germany's emotional state in the days preceding the capitulation. Among those documents, I shall cite Ludendorff's memoirs, Hindenburg's memoirs, and the memoirs of Erdberger, the leader of the German Catholic Center, who was murdered by a nationalist, for his adherence to the revolution and to the German Republic and to the Versailles Peace. Ludendorff, like Hindenburg and like Erdberger, informs us that the Kaiser, considering only of the military aspect of the situation, until the last moment held out the hope of a reaction from the German army which would allow the attainment of peace under the best conditions. The Kaiser thought, our military front has not been broken. Those who surrounded him knew that military front, apparently impregnable to the enemy, had been won by his political propaganda. It had not yet been broken materially, but it was morally nullified. That military front was not ready to obey its generalissimos and its government. In the trenches, revolution was germinating. Up to now, the pan-Germanist Germans, the nationalist Germans, proudly affirm, Germany was not defeated militarily. It's that those pan-Germanists, those nationalists, hold the old concept of relative war, of military war, of diplomatic war. They do not see in the final picture of the war but what the Kaiser saw then, the German military front intact. Their error is the same as the error of the superficial commentators who saw in the Italian defeat at Caporetto only the military causes, and who later saw only military causes in the reorganization of the Italian front. Those nationalists, those pan-Germanists, are impervious to the new concept of total war. It matters little that the defeat of Germany was not a military defeat. In total war, defeat cannot be a military defeat instead of a defeat which is, at once, political, moral, ideological, because in total war military factors are subordinate to political, moral, and ideological factors. In total war, defeat is not called military defeat, though it not stop being such, it is simply called defeat. Defeat, without an adjective, because its only definition is total defeat. The great critics of the World War are, therefore, not military critics. They are not the generalissimos of victory, nor the generalissimos of defeat. They are not Foch nor Hindenburg, not Diaz, nor Ludendorff. The great critics of the World War are philosophers, politicians, sociologists. For the first time, victory has been a matter of ideological strategy and not of military strategy. From this point of view, vast and panoramic, it can thus be said that the generalissimo of victory was Wilson. And, this idea summarizes the value of the United States intervention in the war. We will not at this time make an examination of the Wilsonian program, nor will we at this time make a critique of the illusion the League of Nations. In accordance with this course's program, which brings together the large aspects of the world crisis with a certain chronological arbitrariness necessary for a better panoramic appreciation, we shall leave these things for the class related to the Versailles Peace. My aim in this class has been only that of quickly establishing the value of the United States intervention as a factor in the Allies' victory. The ideology of the American intervention, Wilson's ideology, requires a separate examination. And, this specific examination must be connected with an examination of the Versailles Peace and of its economic and political consequences. Today, we shall dedicate those minutes which we have left to that other transcendental phenomenon of the war, the Russian Revolution and the Russian defeat. We shall take a look at the preliminaries and at the social democratic phase of the Russian Revolution. We shall see how Kerensky's government was arrived at. In the previous lecture, in revealing the conduct of the socialist parties in the warring countries, I told which had been position of the Russian socialists toward the conflagration. In Russia, the majority of the labor and socialist movement was opposed to the war. The group headed by Plekhanov did not believe that victory would strengthen Tsarism, but the socialist and syndicalist majority understood that it had to fight on two fronts, against German imperialism and against Tsarism. Many Russian socialists were loyal to the declaration of the Stuttgart Congress, which laid out the duty of toward the war thusly, work for peace and take advantage of the economic and political consequences of the war to agitate the people and hasten the downfall of the capitalist order. The Tsarist government, needless to say, carried out the war with the criterion of relative war, of military war, of diplomatic war. The Russian war could not count on the solid adherence of the Russian people. The internal political front was, in Russia, weaker than in any other warring country. For these reasons, Russia was, without a doubt, the first to be defeated. Within the Russian bourgeoisie there were democratic and pacifist elements irreconcilable with Tsarism. And, within the Tsar's court there were Germanophile conspirators who plotted in favor of Germany. All these circumstances made defeat and the Russian Revolution inevitable. An interesting document from the days preceding the revolution is Maurice Paléologie's book, The Russia of the Tsars During the Great War. Maurice Paléologue was the ambassador of France to the Tsar. He was a close observer of the fall of Russian absolutism. He attended this spectacle from an stage-side box. The pages of Maurice Paléologie's book describe the official Russian atmosphere of the period of revolutionary incubation. Tsarism's men foresaw the crisis. The diplomatic representatives of the Allied powers felt it as well. And the efforts of one and the other went, not toward preventing it, because it would have been in vain, but toward channeling it into the shape least damaging to their respective interests. The Allied ambassadors in Petrograd worked with the pro-Allied members of the Tsarist regime and with the pro-Allied elements of Russian democracy and social democracy. Paléologue tells us how Milyukov, the leader of the cadets, and other leaders of Russian democracy, ate at his table. The Tsarist regime lacked the moral authority and the political capacity to ably carry out the business of the war. A Germanophilic clique intrigued near the Tsarina. The Tsarina, of a mystical and fanatical temperament, was ruled by the monk, Rasputin, by that strange figure, around whom so many legends were woven and so many fantasies contrived. The army was in morally and materially disastrous conditions. Its supply, munitions, and transport services functioned chaotically. Discontent spread among the soldiers. The Tsar, an imbecile and medieval character, did not allow nor perceive the nearness of the catastrophe. In this situation the murder of the monk, Rasputin, favorite of the Tsarina, the Black Pope of Tsarism, took place. The Tsar ordered the imprisonment of Prince Dmitry, accused of Rasputin's murder. There then began a conflict between the Tsar and the pro-Allied personages in the court who, clear-sightedly, foresaw the dangers and threats of the future. The nobility demanded Prince Dmitry's freedom. The Tsar refused, saying, "A murder is always a murder." Those were days of great anxiety for the Russian aristocracy, which threw the responsibility for the situation upon the Tsarina. Some relatives of the Tsar dared ask for the distancing of the Tsarina from the court. The Tsar resolved to adopt a medievally gentlemanly and exalted attitude. He thought that everyone conspired against the Tsarina because she was a foreigner and a woman. He decided to cover the Tsarina's responsibilities with his own responsibility. The fate of the Russian Empire was in the hands of this stupid and sick man. The Tsarina, deluded and delirious, dialogued with Rasputin's spirit and took up its inspirations. The monk Rasputin, through the Tsarina, inspired the Tsar of all the Russias from beyond the grave. There was hardly anyone in Russia who did not realize that a political and social crisis necessarily had to explode from one moment to the next. It is worth telling a strange anecdote of the Russian court. Paléologue, the French ambassador, and his secretary were invited to lunch on the 10th of January, 1917, the year of the Revolution, at Grand Duchess Maria Pavlova's palace. Paléologue and his secretary ascended the palace's magnificent stairway. Upon entering the grand hall they found in it but a lady-in-waiting to the Grand Duchess, Miss Olive. Miss Olive, standing before the hall's window, pensively contemplated the view of the Neva, in which the Cathedral of St. Peter and St. Paul and the walls of the fortress, the state's prison, stood out. Paléologue courteously interrupted Miss Olive, "I have just surprised, if not your thoughts, then the direction of your thoughts. It seems to me that you very intently gaze upon the prison." She answered, "Yes, I contemplated the prison. In days such as these one cannot keep from looking at it." And later added, turning to the secretary, "Mr. de Chambrun, when I am there, ahead, on the straw of the dungeons, will you come see me?" The young lady-in-waiting, probably an avid and horrified reader of the history of the French Revolution, foresaw that the same fate as that of the French nobility of the 18th century was reserved for the Russian nobility, and that she, like other beautiful and elegant and fine ladies-in-waiting, in other times, was destined to a tragic and somber residence in a dungeon of some gloomy Bastille. The days of the Russian autocracy were numbered. The aristocracy and the bourgeoisie worked so the fall of Tsarism would not be their fall as well. The Allied representatives worked so that the transition from the Tsarist regime to a new regime did not bring a period of anarchy and disorder which would render Russia useless as an Allied power. Indirectly, the aristocracy divorced from the Tsar, the bourgeoisie, and the Allied ambassadors did nothing other than hasten the revolution. Interested in channeling the revolution, in avoiding spillovers, and in limiting its magnitude, they all contributed to increase the revolution's seeds. And, the revolution came. Power was briefly in the hands of a prince of the pro-Allied aristocracy. But, the people's action made it pass immediately into the hands of men closer to the masses' revolutionary ideals. Kerensky's coalition government was built upon the social revolutionaries and the Mensheviks. Kerensky was an anemic figure of Russian revolutionism. Afraid of the revolution, fearful of its extreme consequences, he did not want that his government be exclusively worker, exclusively proletarian, exclusively socialist. He thus made a coalition government of the social revolutionaries and the Mensheviks with the cadets and the liberals. In this indecisive atmosphere, in this vacillating situation, in this structurally precarious and provisional order, the Bolshevik Revolution was germinated, bit by bit. In the next class we will see how this great event, toward which turns the gaze of all of the universal proletariat, which, above all divisions and all disagreements of doctrine, sees in the Russian Revolution, humanity's first step toward an order of brotherhood, peace, and justice, was prepared, and how it occurred. History of the World Crisis. Lecture 5. The Russian Revolution. By J.C. Mariategua. Translated by Juan Arfa Yardo, 1998. Delivered to the González Prada People's University. At the Peruvian Student Federation Hall, Lima, on July 13, 1923. According to the program for this course on the history of the world crisis, the subject for tonight's lecture is the Russian Revolution. The course program assigns the following summary to tonight's lecture: the Russian Revolution. Kerensky. Lenin. The Peace of Brest-Litovsk. Russia and the Entente before the Revolution. Initial process of creation and consolidation of the Russian institutions. Before speaking on these topics, I consider a warning to be opportune. The things I am going to say about the Russian Revolution are basic things. That is to say, they are things which, to other audiences, would seem too elementary, too popularized, too often repeated, because those audiences have been abundantly informed about the Russian Revolution, its men, its episodes. In Europe, the Russian Revolution has been of interest, and will continue to be of interest, to people's unanimous curiosity. In Europe, the Russian Revolution has been, and will continue to be a subject of general study. Innumerable books have been published about the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution had occupied a high priority place in all the European dailies and magazines. The study of this event has not been sectarianly reserved for its partisans, for its propagandists. It has been taken up by all inquisitive men, by all men with any intellectual curiosity. The European bourgeoisie's principal organs, the largest presses of European capitalism, have sent correspondents to Russia, in order to inform their audiences about the Russian institutions and about the revolution's figures. Naturally, those large dailies have invariably attacked the Russian Revolution, have made use of numerous polemical weapons against it, but their correspondents, not all, naturally, but many of them have spoken with some objectivity about Russian events. They have acted as simple chroniclers of Russia's situation. Obviously, this has been due, not to benevolence toward the Russian Revolution, but because those large news dailies, in their competition for disputing one another for readers, for disputing clients, have been forced to satisfy the public's curiosity with some seriousness and some circumspection. The public demanded more or less serious and more or less circumspect information about Russia from them, and they without lessening their aversion to the Russian Revolution had to give the public that more or less serious and more or less circumspect information. Correspondents from Associated Press of New York, correspondents from Corriere della Sera, from the Messaggero, and other large Italian presses, correspondents from Theodore Wolff's large democratic daily, the Berliner Tageblatt, correspondents from the London press, have gone to Russia. Many great contemporary writers have gone as well. One of those has been Wells. I cite him at random. I point him out because the attention attracted by Wells' visit to Russia, and by the book which Wells wrote upon returning to England, has been universal, has been very widespread, and, because Wells is not even amongst us suspected of Bolshevism. Urged on by the scholarly public's demand, the large publishing houses of Paris, London, Rome, Berlin, have published compilations of Russian laws and essays about this or that aspect of the Russian Revolution. These books and pamphlets were not the work of Bolshevik propaganda, they were simply an editorial business. The large publishers, the large booksellers, made very good sums of money with those books and pamphlets. That is why they published and distributed them. It could be said that the Russian Revolution was in style. Just as speaking of relativism and Einstein's theory sounded good, speaking of the Russian Revolution and its leaders sounded good. This, insofar as the bourgeois public, the amorphous public, is concerned. As far as the proletariat is concerned, curiosity about the Russian Revolution has, naturally, been much greater. In all the proletariat's tribunes, all its newspapers, all its books, the Russian Revolution has been commented on, studied, and discussed. In the reformist and social democratic sector as much as in the anarchist sector, on the right, as on the left, and in the center, of the proletarian organizations, the Russian Revolution has been incessantly examined and observed. For these reasons, other audiences of vast knowledge of the Bolshevik Revolution, of the Soviet institutions, of the Brest-Litovsk peace, of these things which I will deal with tonight, and for those audiences my lecture will be too basic, too rudimentary. But I have to keep in mind the position of our public, ill-informed about this and other great European events. The responsibility is not theirs, but of our intellectuals and our scholars, who are, in reality, not any such intellectuals or scholars but caricatures of scholars and caricatures of intellectuals. I will, thus, speak tonight as a journalist. I shall narrate, I shall relay, I shall tell, concisely, basically, without erudition and without literature. In the last lecture, after having quickly examined Italy's intervention and the United States' intervention in the Great War, we got to Tsarism, to the preliminaries to the Russian Revolution. We shall now examine the months of the Kerensky government. Kerensky, a conspicuous member of the Social Revolutionary Party, whom I have already perhaps none too amicably introduced to you, was the leader of the Russian government during the months which preceded the October Revolution, that is, the Bolshevik Revolution. Kerensky presided over the Social Revolutionaries and the Mensheviks' coalition government with the Cadets and the Liberals. This coalition government represented the middle groups within Russian public opinion. On the one hand, the monarchists, the reactionaries, the extreme right, and, on the other hand, the Bolsheviks, the maximalist revolutionaries, the extreme left, were missing from this coalition. The absence of the extreme right was something logical, something natural. The extreme right was the overthrown party. It was the royal family's party. By contrast, the presence within the coalition and, hence, in the ministry headed by Kerensky of bourgeois elements, of capitalist elements, such as the liberals and the cadets, changed the coalition and changed the government into a melding, an amalgam, a heterogeneous, anodyne, colorless conglomeration. A government of conciliation, a coalition government, is conceived of in another type of situation. But a government of conciliation is not conceived of within a revolutionary situation. By force, a revolutionary government has to be a faction government, a party government, it must represent only the revolutionary nuclei of public opinion, it must not include the intermediate groups, must not include the virtually, tacitly, conservative nuclei. Thus the Kerensky government suffered from an organic defect, from a grave essential vice. It embodied neither the proletariat's ideals nor the bourgeoisie's ideals. It lived off of concessions, off of commitments to one side and the other. One day, it gave in to the right, on another, it gave in to the left. I repeat, all this fits within an evolutionist situation. But it does not fit within a situation of civil war, of armed struggle, of violent revolution. From the beginning, the Bolsheviks attacked the coalition government, and demanded the constitution of a proletarian government, of a workers' government, in short, of a revolutionary government. Well, now, the proletarian, the workers, groups in Russia were four. Four were the nuclei of revolutionary opinion. The Mensheviks, in other words, the minimalists, headed by Martov and Chernov, people with some tradition, and collaborationists. The social revolutionaries, to whose ranks Kerensky, Tsereteli, and others belonged, who found themselves split into two groups, one, on the right, favorable to coalition with the bourgeoisie, and the one on the left, leaning toward the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks, or the Maximalists, the party of Lenin, of Zinoviev, of Trotsky. And, the anarchists, who in the land of Kropotkin and Bakunin were, naturally, numerous. The socialists were split into the first three groups, Mensheviks, social revolutionaries, and Bolsheviks. Because, as is natural, in the period of struggle against Tsarism all these proletarian forces had struggled together. There were programmatic differences, but there was community of forces and, above all, of efforts against the absolute autocracy of the Tsars. What was the position, what was the makeup, which was the strength of each of these proletarian groups? The Mensheviks and the social revolutionaries were dominant in the countryside, amongst the workers of the land. More than of manual workers, their central nuclei were made up of middle-class elements, of men from liberal professions, lawyers, doctors, engineers, etc. The social revolutionaries' left wing did, in fact, bring together many truly proletarian and class-conscious elements, who, for this reason, were attracted by the Bolshevik tactics and tendency, but would not break with the group's right wing. The men of the right and the center, such as Kerensky, were those who represented the social revolutionaries. Both parties, the Mensheviks and the social revolutionaries, were not, therefore, true revolutionary parties. They did not represent socialism's most dynamic, most class-conscious, most homogeneous sector, the industrial proletariat, the proletariat of the city. The Maximalists were weak in the countryside, but they were strong in the city. Their ranks were built on the basis of truly proletarian elements. In the Maximalist high command the intellectual element prevailed, but the mass of members were workers. The Maximalists acted in living, intense, constant, contact with the workers of the factories and mills. They were the party of Petrograd's and Moscow's industrial proletariat. The anarchists were also influential amongst the industrial proletariat, but their central foci were intellectual foci. Russia was traditionally the country of the anarchist, nihilist intelligentsia. Intellectuals, students, predominated in the anarchist nuclei. Of course, anarchists fought the Mensheviks and Kerensky's social revolutionaries as much as the Bolsheviks did, and, in some instances, in agreement with them. This was the Russian proletariat's political landscape under the Kerensky government. In accordance with this summary of the situation, the majority belonged to the social revolutionaries and Mensheviks. The peasant masses and the middle class was on their side. And, the peasant masses made up the majority in the agricultural nation, in a little industrialized nation such as Russia. In contrast, the Bolsheviks could count on the most combative, most organized, most effective, elements, on the industrial proletariat, on the workers of the city. On the other hand, the Mensheviks and the social revolutionaries could not keep up their strength, their predominance among the peasant masses if they did not satisfy two entrenched ideals, two urgent demands of those masses, immediate peace and land distribution. The Kerensky government lacked the freedom of action for one or the other thing. It lacked freedom of action for immediate peace because the Allied powers, by which it was fostered and protected, did not allow it to reach a separate agreement with Germany. And it lacked freedom of action to distribute lands to the peasants because its alliance with the cadets and the liberals, its commitments to the bourgeoisie, its understandings with the landowners inhibited it, coerced it from this daring revolutionary reform. Thus, Kerensky, in government, did not carry out the policies of the socialist masses whom he represented, he carried out the policies of the Russian bourgeoisie and the Allied powers. This political course made the masses impatient. The masses wanted peace. And peace did not come. The masses wanted the distribution of the lands. And the distribution of the lands did not come, either. However, the impatience of the peasant masses would not have sufficed to bring down Kerensky if it had, in fact, been the impatience only of the peasant masses instead of being the army's impatience as well. The war was unpopular in Russia. I have already explained how the Tsarist government carried out the war with a mentality of relative war, that is, with a mentality of war of armies and not war of nations. Consequently, the Tsarist government had not been able to win the people's adherence to its military endeavor. The people and the army hoped that for the revolution peace would emerge. Kerensky's inability to achieve peace roused the army which, unlike the other Allied armies, did not perceive the myth of war of democracy against autocracy because the Russian war had been directed by the Tsarist autocracy against his government. The army was tired of war, and deftly demanded peace. The Bolsheviks aimed their propaganda in a sagaciously popular direction. They demanded immediate peace and they demanded the distribution of lands. And they told the proletariat, neither the one nor the other can be done by a government of coalition with the bourgeoisie. We must replace this government with a proletarian government, with a workers' government, with a government of the parties of the working class. This government must be the Soviets' government. And the Bolsheviks' battle cry was, all political power to the Soviets. The Soviets existed since the fall of Tsarism. The word Soviet means council in Russian. Once the revolution was victorious, Tsarism deposed, the Russian proletariat proceeded to the organization of councils of workers, peasants, and soldiers. The Soviets, the councils of the toilers of the land and the factories, grouped into local Soviets. The local Soviets created a national body, the All-Russia Congress of Soviets. The Soviets thus fully represented the proletariat. In the Soviets there were Mensheviks, anarchists, and non-partisan workers. Kerensky and the social revolutionaries and the Mensheviks had not wanted the Soviets to directly and exclusively exercise power. Educated in the school of democracy, respectful of parliamentarianism, they had wanted a ministry of coalition with the bourgeois parties without a base within the Soviets to exercise power. The proletariat's organs were not the government organs. There was in Russia a dual situation. Therefore, the Bolsheviks' cry, all political power to the Soviets, did not mean all political power to the maximalist party. It simply meant, all political power to the organized proletariat. The Bolsheviks were in a minority in the Soviets, in which the social revolutionaries prevailed. But, their activity, their dynamism, and their program, were each day winning more followers in the workers' and soldiers' Soviets. Soon the Bolsheviks came to be a majority in the Soviets of the capital and other industrial centers. Consequently, Kerensky was not opposed to the Bolsheviks coming into government. He was opposed to the government passing into the hands of the proletariat, within whose bodies he still held a majority. Kerensky and his men proceeded thusly because they feared the revolution, because the idea of the revolution being carried to its extreme consequences, to its final goal, terrified them, and because they understood that the Bolsheviks would end up winning the majority in the Soviets in part, due to their personal worth and, in part, to their program, which was the program of the masses. Under the pressure of political events and under the suggestion of the Allied powers, Kerensky's government committed a fatal adventure, the June 18 offensive against the Austro-Germans. For Kerensky, the military offensive was a risky and dangerous card. But at least it was a transitory diversion of public opinion. Kerensky's government wanted to distract popular attention toward the front. The Bolsheviks vigorously impugned the offensive. The Bolsheviks, as I have said, interpreted the public's desires for peace. Moreover, they thought the military offensive carried two grave dangers for the revolution. If the offensive succeeded, something improbable, given the army's conditions, it would unite the bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie, it would strengthen them politically and would isolate the revolutionary proletariat. If the offensive failed, something almost certain, the offensive would bring about a complete dissolution of the army, a ruinous retreat, the loss of new territories, and disillusionment of the proletariat. Leon Trotsky defines the Bolsheviks' position toward the offensive thusly, in his book, From the October Revolution to the Brest-Litovsk Peace. The offensive, as had been foreseen, had lamentable consequences. The Russian army suffered a hard blow. The masses' discontent with Kerensky, the longing for immediate peace, were accentuated and spread. The Bolsheviks began a violent campaign of agitation of the proletariat. The Kerensky government repressed this agitation campaign without remorse. Many Bolsheviks were arrested, others had to flee and hide. In this situation, General Kornilov's reactionary attempt took place. Pushed by the bourgeoisie, which plotted intensely against the revolution, he rebelled against Kerensky. But his reactionary attempt had no echo amongst the soldiers at the front, who desired peace and, knowing their chauvinist and nationalist mentality, regarded reactionary elements with hostility. The workers of Petrograd vigorously rose up in defense of the revolution. Kornilov's insurrection was completely aborted, but it served to increase the masses' revolutionary vigilance and, consequently, to strengthen the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks redoubled the cry, "All governmental power to the Soviets." The social revolutionaries and the Mensheviks, in order to quiet the masses, resorted to a crafty maneuver. They put together a democratic conference, a mixed assembly of the Soviets and other autonomous groups, whose composition assured Kerensky a majority. From the democratic conference there emerged a democratic Soviet. This democratic Soviet, completed with the representatives of the bourgeois parties allied with Kerensky, made itself into a preliminary parliament. This preliminary parliament was to move toward a constituent assembly. The Bolsheviks received 50 seats in the preliminary parliament, but the Bolsheviks left the preliminary parliament. They invited the left social revolutionaries, those who did not share Kerensky's ideas, to also abandon him. But the left social revolutionaries did not decide to break with Kerensky and join the Bolsheviks. The situation became ever more agitated. The atmosphere ever more flammable. Let us see how the final spark was lit. In defense of the revolution, the Petrograd Soviet had created a revolutionary military committee intended to safeguard the army from reactionary moves such as Kornilov's. This revolutionary military committee, a fundamentally revolutionary and proletarian grouping, lived in conflict with Kerensky's high command. Kerensky conspired against its existence on the grounds that it was not possible for two high commands to function in Petrograd. The government saw in the Revolutionary Committee the future center of the Bolshevik Revolution. It resolved then to take a series of military measures which would assure it military control of Petrograd. It ordered the distancing from Petrograd of troops loyal to the Soviet and obedient to the Revolutionary Military Committee, and the calling in of new troops from the front. These dispositions unleashed the Bolshevik Revolution. On October 22, Kerensky's high command invited the garrison corps to each send 2 delegates to reach an agreement on the moving away of rebellious troops. The garrison corps responded that they would not obey but a resolution from the Petrograd Soviet. It was the explicit declaration of the rebellion. Some troops, however, were still vacillating. The Bolsheviks carried out, with efficient activity, a quick propaganda campaign to win them to their cause. The Kerensky government called in troops from the front. These troops got in communication with the Bolsheviks, who ordered them to stop their advance. And, the final day arrived. On October 25, the Petrograd troops surrounded the Winter Palace, the Kerensky government's refuge, and Leon Trotsky, in the name of the Revolutionary Military Committee, announced to the Petrograd Soviet that Kerensky's government had ceased to exist and that from that moment on political powers passed into the hands of the Revolutionary Military Committee, awaiting a decision from the All-Russia Congress of Soviets. On October 26, the Congress of Soviets met. Lenin and Zinoviev, persecuted under the Kerensky government, reappeared, greeted with great applause. Lenin presented two proposals, peace, and the distribution of lands to the peasants. The two were instantaneously approved. The Bolsheviks invited the left social revolutionaries to collaborate with them in the formation of a new government, but the social revolutionaries, always vacillating and irresolute, demurred from accepting. Then, the Bolshevik Party wholly assumed the responsibility of government. The Congress of Soviets entrusted power to a Soviet of People's Commissars. The Bolshevik Revolution had days of intense worry and constant threat. The public employees and functionaries sabotaged it. The students of the military school rebelled. Bolshevik troops repressed this insurrection. Kerensky, who had managed to flee the government palace, threatened Petrograd at the head of General Krasnov's Cossacks, but the Bolsheviks overthrew him in Tsarskoye Selo. And Kerensky fled a second time. The Bolsheviks sent messengers to all the provinces, communicating the formation of a new government and the passing of the decrees on peace and land distribution. The telegraph and the transportation services boycotted and cut off communications. The troops at the front remained loyal to them because they were the party of peace. There came a period of negotiations between the Soviets and the Entente. The Soviets proposed to the Entente the joint negotiation of peace. These proposals were not considered. The Bolsheviks were forced to approach the Germans separately. The Brest-Litovsk negotiations began. Before and after them, there were conversations between the diplomatic representatives of the Allied powers and Russia. But an agreement was impossible. The Allies thought that the Bolsheviks would hardly last in government. The Brest-Litovsk peace was inevitable. This, quickly summarized, is the history of the Russian Revolution. I will, at the end of this lecture course, give the history of the Soviet Republic, the explanation of Russian legislation, the study of the Russian institutions, the analysis of Soviet politics. In accordance with the course program which, as I have said, groups events with a certain arbitrariness, but allows a better overall understanding, in the next lecture I shall speak on the German Revolution. We will thus arrive at another substantial episode, another primary chapter, in the history of the world crisis, which is the history of the breakdown, and of the decadence or the decline of the proud capitalist civilization. History of the World Crisis. Lecture 6. The German Revolution. By J.C. Mariategua. Translated by Juan Arfa Yardo, 1998. Delivered to the González Prada People's University. At the Peruvian Student Federation Hall, Lima, on July 13, 1923. The subject of tonight's lecture is the German Revolution. In the preceding lectures I have explained the main aspects of the German Revolution's process of generation, of incubation. I have stated already that the war was not popular in Germany, that the German government carried out the war with the old criterion of relative war, of military war, of not total war, that the German government was unable to create any popular myth capable of ensuring it the solid support of the popular classes, and that the war was presented to the German people solely as a war of national defense. While the German government kept alive the hope of victory, while no military failures discredited its adventure, while it was able to keep the populace from hunger and privations, it succeeded in that public opinion withstand the war without rebellion. But, it did not manage to excite the people toward its imperialist ideals. The war was not popular with the proletariat. The intellectuals, the German intelligentsia, in their majority, placed themselves at the service of the war of aggression and created a cynical, ranting war literature. The German poets chanted war and denigrated peace. Thomas Mann wrote, "Man is spoiled in peace. Slothful repose is the heart's tomb. The law is the friend of the weak, she wishes to level everything, if she could she would flatten the world, but war makes strength emerge." Heinrich Weyrord wrote his Deutschland, Hass, Germany, hate. Professor Oswald wrote, Germany wishes to organize Europe, since Europe has, to now, never been organized. Finally, the famous 93 German intellectuals signed that notorious manifesto servilely sponsoring and defending the German war. But, all this bellicose literature notwithstanding, only the bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie were delirious with nationalism. The proletariat declared that its support for the war was not from conviction, but duty. The proletariat never subscribed to the bourgeois and petty bourgeois intellectual cynical ideas. What is more, almost from the first instant, as soon as the period of intoxication and confusion from the declaration of war had passed, some honest and brave voices of protest were raised in Germany. 4 German wise men took a position against the 93 intellectuals of the manifesto, and published their own counter-manifesto. I have already spoken to you of these 4 wise men, who were the physicist, Einstein, the physiologist, Nicolai, the philosopher, Gluck, and the astronomer, Forster. The poet, Hermann Hesse, like Romain Rolland, in asylum in Switzerland, wrote an ode to peace and a call to Europe's thinkers to rescue what little of peace could still be saved and to not themselves, with their pens, pillage Europe's future. The journal, Die Wiesenblätter, was a home to German intellectuals loyal to the cause of Europe's, and Western civilization's, moral unity. And, various leaders of the proletariat, Karl Liebknecht, Rosa Luxemburg, Kurt Eisner, Franz Mehring, Leo Jogi-Ces, and others reacted against the war and denounced its imperialist and counter-revolutionary goal. Karl Liebknecht was one of the 14 deputies opposed to war credits on August 4, but these 14 deputies did not vote against war credits in Parliament, but in the heart of the socialist group in Parliament. The great majority of the group agreed to vote for the credits. The 14 deputies in the minority, Karl Liebknecht among them, resolved to submit to the majority's decision. However, Karl Liebknecht soon felt the necessity of rescuing his own and personal responsibility as a leader and as a socialist intellectual. In December of 1914 he voted against the new war credits, without paying attention to the will of the socialist parliamentary group. Of course, inside and outside of the Reichstag, of the German parliament, a tempest was unleashed against Karl Liebknecht. In January of 1915 Karl Liebknecht was drafted into the army. He was sent to Kustrin. Liebknecht refused to accept a gun. He was then transferred to a company of laborers, of suspects, in Lorraine. Later he was sent to the Russian front. From the front, Karl Liebknecht wrote to his children on December 21, "I will not shoot." He still attended other sessions of the Reichstag, where he again spoke out on several occasions against the German government and against the war. The clamor of the chamber invariably covered, overwhelmed, and drowned out his solitary and heroic voice. But Karl Liebknecht did not renounce his propaganda, and together with Rosa Luxemburg, Franz Mehring, Clara Zetkin, he wrote those famous letters signed with the pseudonym of Spartacus, which later was the name of the German Communist Party. On May 1 of 1918 there took place in Berlin the first public demonstration against the war. Karl Liebknecht, disguised as a civilian, attended. He was arrested and tried for treason against the fatherland. The military tribunal sentenced him to 4 years of forced labor. A year later, the revolution opened the doors to his jail. The figure of Liebknecht, as we can see, was not the only one in the leading ranks of the German proletariat which struggled against the war. At Liebknecht's side stand several glorious figures. I have already mentioned Rosa Luxemburg, Clara Zetkin, Eugen Levine. All these leaders recognized that their duty was to fight against the war, as they later recognized that their duty was to carry the revolution through to the end. All of them belonged, like Karl Liebknecht, to the Spartacus Group, the initial cell of the German Communist Party. But, I shall deal with their conduct during the revolution itself in due time. Right now, what is under examination is but their conduct during the pre-revolution, because, based on it, I hold that there was in the German proletarian movement a different attitude toward the war than in the proletarian movement in the Allied nations. A numerous nucleus of proletarian opinion repressed militarily, it is true, by the government's action struggled to turn the German proletariat against the war. And the 100 deputies of German socialism, the majority of social democracy's leaders, could not give the war ardoroused and unconditional support. The German bourgeoisie and middle class fought for the ideals of Prussian militarism, for world domination, for Deutschland über alles, for Übervolk, for Europe's submission to German organization, but the German proletariat, in accordance with the marching orders from its majority leaders, fought but in the interest of national defense. The German proletariat did not feel the absolute need for war jusqu'au-bout, for war to the end, for total war, and, above all, until the enemy's total annihilation. Consequently, Wilson and his democratic propaganda, Wilson and his 14 points, Wilson and his illusions of a new code of international justice, found a permeable front, a vulnerable front, a yielding front, in the German front. I have already stated the revolutionary resonance which the Wilsonian program attained amongst the populace. Ever since the Austrian people were told that the Allies fought, not against them, but against their governments, ever since they were assured that they would not have imposed on them a peace of annexations, nor of indemnizations, the German and Austrian peoples began to feel ever less a need for the war. Furthermore, as I have also said already, the Wilsonian propaganda stimulated and awoke old and deep-rooted ideals of national independence in the nationalities locked in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. On the other hand, the Russian Revolution also revolutionarily echoed within the Austrian proletariat and in the German proletariat. Two propagandas joined to undermine and break through the Austro-German front, Wilson's democratic propaganda and the Bolsheviks' maximalist propaganda. The effects of these propagandas had to be manifest following the first Austro-German military defeat. The Italian offensive in Piave found the Austrian army little disposed towards sacrifice. The Czechoslovakian troops gave up almost en masse. And, on the German front, the news of this disaster and of the French offensive, unleashed the explosion of revolutionary seeds, so long accumulated. The German people and the German army made evident their desire for peace and capitulation. They rose up against the Kaiser and the monarchy, against the regime responsible for the war and to blame for the defeat. They defined the responsibility of the German government and that of the German people. And they swept away the monarchy and all its institutions. November 9 of 1918, little more than a year from the Russian Revolution, the German Revolution took place. The history of the events of those days is well known. There broke out a revolutionary strike in Kiel and Hamburg. The sailors rebelled and, in automobiles, marched on Berlin. A general strike was declared. The troops refused to repress the insurgent proletariat. The Kaiser abdicated and left Berlin. And the revolutionaries proclaimed a republic in Germany. The revolution had, at that moment, a purely proletarian character. Workers' and soldiers' councils in effect, Soviets were created in Germany. A cabinet of majority socialists was formed. But this cabinet did not include socialism's left wing, the group of Karl Liebknecht, Rosa Luxemburg, Franz Mehring, Clara Zetkin, etc., contrary to an agreement with the majority socialists who had supported the war. Moreover, hostilities quickly arose between the group of Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg and the governing socialists. Karl Liebknecht founded the Spartacus Union, the German Communist Party, and the Spartacists' news organ, Die Rote Fahne, the Red Flag. The Spartacists propounded the fulfillment of socialism through the dictatorship of the proletariat, through Soviet government. They demanded the confiscation of all crown properties for the benefit of the collective. the annulment of state debts and war loans, the expropriation of large and medium agricultural properties and the formation of agricultural cooperatives to administer them, while small properties remained in the hands of their small holders until they voluntarily desired to join the cooperatives, the nationalization of all banks, mines, factories, and large industrial and commercial establishments. In sum, the Spartacists proposed the carrying out in Germany of the program carried out by the Maximalists in Russia. The majority socialists Ebert, Scheidemann, etc. were averse to this program. And the masses who followed them were not spiritually ready for so radical a transformation of the order in Germany. The independent socialists Koskai, Haas, Hildferding, etc. were vacillant. They inclined neither toward the limited and opaque reformism of the majoritarians, nor toward the Spartacists' revolutionism. In the Bolshevik manner, the Spartacists began a campaign of mounting agitation. The figures which led the Spartacus Union were, certainly, figures of the front rank of the German proletarian movement. Karl Liebknecht was the son of Wilhelm Liebknecht, one of the patriarchs of German socialism. He was, thus, heir to a glorious name in the history of German socialism, aside from possessor of a bright, intense figure continuously in the vanguard of the proletariat. Rosa Luxemburg, an international figure and an intellectual and dynamic figure, also had an eminent position within German socialism. Her double capacity for action and for thought, for realization and for theory, were seen and respected. Rosa Luxemburg was, at once, a brain and an arm of the German proletariat. Franz Mehring was one of the most profound, shining, and erudite theoreticians of Marxism, author of a series of deep and admirable works. He had written a fundamental book precisely on Marx and on Marxism. He was old, he was 72, but he kept the temper and fervor of his youth. Eugen Levin, a Russian Pole, who participated in the 1905 revolution in Russia, and who then endured prison in Siberia, was another noble and bizarre revolutionary figure. He came from a rich family and possessed a vast literary and scientific culture. He had, nonetheless, renounced his prerogatives as an intellectual and had become a worker. Leo Jogi Ches, Polish journalist, also a noteworthy kind of agitator, propagandist, and revolutionary, was the collaborator, the confidant, the friend of Rosa Luxemburg. In the Polish Socialist Party he had played an outstanding role, and in the Spartacus Union he was the energetic and untiring organizer of action and propaganda. Clara Zetkin, the sole survivor from this group of leaders, conductors, and apostles, was of the same moral and intellectual stature. This strong, homogeneous, and intelligent general staff of Spartacism managed to agitate, to powerfully shake up the German proletariat. The German working masses lack spiritual and revolutionary preparation, and I will speak to you of this in a moment in critiquing the revolution. Nevertheless, the Spartacist leaders managed to organize a new proletarian vanguard. This proletarian vanguard was a vanguard of action, but the Spartacist leaders did not intend to launch it prematurely to the seizure of power. They proposed to use it to awaken the proletariat's consciousness, to day by day prepare it for action, strengthen it numerically, ready it for the decisive assault at the opportune moment. The tactic of the majority socialists, of Ebert and Scheidemann's government, thus consisted in precipitating the Spartacists' revolutionary action, in drawing the Spartacists into combat prematurely, in obligating them to begin the battle unpreparedly. The majority socialists needed the Spartacists' violence in order to repress their violence with an even greater violence, and, in this way, to eliminate an increasingly dangerous enemy. The Spartacist masses, imprudently, did not measure their steps. The governor of Berlin, Eichhorn, was a left socialist, a revolutionary, widely popular in the German capital. He was an element undocile toward the reaction and loyal to the revolution and to the proletariat. The majority socialist government decided to demand his resignation. This was a provocation toward Berlin's revolutionary proletariat. On Sunday, January 5 of 1919, there were large revolutionary demonstrations in Berlin. The next day a strike was declared. The masses, angry at the official organ of the Socialist Party, Vorwärts, which had been taken over by several majority socialists, resolved to forcibly occupy this and other dailies. They built barricades, but took pains to avoid the spilling of blood, inviting the troops by means of large signs to not fire upon their proletarian brothers. Nonetheless, the clashes soon began. Some agents provocateurs, it seems, were used to spark the struggle. The fact of the matter is that between the troops and the Spartacist masses battle was begun. Niski, a majority socialist, took charge of the Ministry of War and, with the enthusiastic cooperation of the old regime's officers, organized the repression of the insurgents. There were, in Berlin, several days of bloody battles. On Sunday the 12th, the Spartacists who were occupying Vorwärts sent 6 unarmed parleyers to negotiate peace with the besiegers of the occupied press. The 6 parleyers were shot. The fighting continued. The Spartacist leaders had not wanted to lead the masses into struggle, but once it begun, once the battle had started, they felt it that their duty was to take up their posts alongside the masses. The authorities attributed to them sole responsibility for the insurrection of the Spartacist masses and set out in pursuit of them. On the afternoon of January 15, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, who had hidden in a friendly house, in a neighborhood in West Berlin, in Wilmersdorf, were arrested by the troops. Hours later, they were murdered. The official version of their death states that both tried to escape from their guards' hands, and that these, in order to avoid the escape, were forced to open fire and kill them. The truth, however, was another. Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg fell into the hands of officers of the old regime, fanatical enemies of the revolution, ranting reactionaries, who hated all the authors of the Kaiser's fall, believing them responsible for Germany's capitulation. These people did not want the 2 great revolutionaries to enter prison alive. But the revolutionary wave was not extinguished with this bloody episode of the deaths of Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. The German proletariat's vanguard kept on demanding socialist policies from the government. The majority socialists, who with the cooperation and approval of the bourgeoisie had truculently put down the Spartacist insurrection, were each day more encumbered for carrying out a socialization program in government. In February and March the proletariat gradually resumes a combative posture. Again, strikes break out, which from the Rhine region, and from Westphalia, spread to central Germany, to Baden, Bavaria, Württemberg. In these strikes the workers move from demands for wage increases to the demand for socialization and the establishment of a Soviet government. The majority government appeases these movements with a series of vague and pompous promises. With these promises it manages to quiet the masses. But, a part of them showed a decidedly revolutionary will, and new bloody days took place in Berlin. The victims of the repression were, once again, counted in the thousands. Spartakism lost another of its best leaders. Leo Jogi Ces, captured soon after the March days, had a fate analogous to that of Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. He was not murdered on the way to prison, but in the prison itself. It was said he tried to escape, the eternal tale of escape, and that, because of this, it had been necessary to fire upon him. However, with these battles by Berlin's proletarian vanguard that period of revolutionary activity in Germany did not end. The Munich proletariat also waged courageous battles, and the repression in Munich was bloodier, and more costly for the proletariat than the repression in Berlin. In Munich, in Bavaria, Soviet governments were put in place. The Soviet Republic of Munich was one of artificial Sovietism, of communist window dressing, but this was natural. In the government, reformist elements, semi-bourgeois elements which did not give the Bavarian Republic a truly revolutionary orientation predominated. Thus, the life of this Soviet Republic could not be a long one. On the one hand, because this government Soviet in form, reformist in content was incapable of disarming the bourgeoisie, of abolishing its privileges, nor of evicting it from its positions. On the other hand, because Bavaria was the region of Germany least ready for the establishment of socialism. Bavaria is Germany's agricultural region. Bavaria is a country of estates and latifundia, not of factories. The industrial proletariat, the axis of proletarian revolution, is, thus, in the minority. The agricultural proletariat, the agricultural middle class, absolutely predominates. As is known, the agricultural proletariat does not have enough socialist saturation, enough class-conscious education, to serve as the basis for the socialist order. The instrument of the socialist revolution shall always be the industrial proletariat, the proletariat of the cities. Furthermore, the carrying out of socialism in Bavaria was not possible while capitalism survived in the rest of Germany. Even so much as a socialist Bavaria, a communist Bavaria, within a bourgeois Germany was inconceivable. Once the revolution was defeated in Berlin, it was so in Munich as well. The Bavarian communists did not give up the struggle, however, and fought without quarter to turn the Munich Soviet Republic into a true communist republic. Little by little, this transformation began to take place. The Bavarian proletariat's consciousness developed day by day. Truly revolutionary workers were chosen for the leading posts. That was, simultaneously, the moment of the bourgeois counter-offensive. Victorious over the proletariat in Berlin, the German bourgeoisie began the attack on the proletariat in Munich. The communist masses of Munich had no better fortune than those of Berlin. And, another of the leaders of Spartakism, Eugen Levine, that Polish-Russian intellectual of whom I spoke to you a few moments ago, was the martyr of that revolutionary endeavor. Eugen Levine was not murdered like Karl Liebknecht, like Rosa Luxemburg, etc., but was executed by firing squad in a Munich prison. He was given a lightning trial and was condemned to death. Facing the execution squad, Eugen Levine behaved courageously, and died with the cry, "Long live universal revolution," on his lips. These, briefly narrated, are the main Spartacist episodes of the German Revolution. This was the sharpest and climactic moment of the revolution. Once this period of agitation which Spartacism's leaders created with their unflagging activity had passed, the German people showed each day less revolutionary zeal. Power was, to begin with, in the hands of the majority socialists, backed by the independent socialists, in other words, by the centrist socialists. It was then in the hands of the majority socialists alone. Later, the majority socialists, educated in the democratic school, required the collaboration of two bourgeois parties, the Catholic Center, the party of Ertberger, and the Democratic Party, the party of Walter Rathenau and of the Berliner Tageblatt. As the majority socialists, opposed to the thesis of the dictatorship of the proletariat, had scheduled parliamentary elections, they were left at the mercy of the combinations of parliamentary equilibrium. Lacking the collaboration of one part of the socialist votes, they had to look for cooperation from an equal or greater number of bourgeois votes. The National Assembly sanctioned a democratic constitution in Weimar, but not a socialist constitution. The majority socialists could not entirely hold on to power within the parliamentary order, but they were indispensable for the formation of a majority. That is why we have seen them enter all the coalition cabinets that have followed. But at the present cabinet, the cabinet of Kuno, the majority socialists no longer appear. Their benevolent neutrality in parliament continues being necessary for the life of the cabinet. However, the cabinet is no longer a cabinet with majority socialist participation, but a coalition cabinet of the German bourgeois parties, a coalition in which only the extreme bourgeois right is missing, only the Pan-Germanic Party, that is, the party of the monarchy. Following the Spartacist insurrection, the German Revolution has done naught but turn to the right, always to the right. First, power was exercised by the right and center socialists jointly, then, by the right socialists alone. Later, by the right socialists in collaboration with the more liberal bourgeois parties. Currently, through these bourgeois parties, sheltered by the right socialists' benevolent neutrality, little by little, the German Revolution has been losing all socialist character and been affirming its democratic character, its bourgeois character. That is why it is now said that the German Revolution hasn't yet been consummated. That the German Revolution has but begun. Rudolf Hilferding, he old leader of the independent socialists, said in the Halle Congress in 1920 that, "We have always said that December 9th, in a certain way, was not a true revolution. We did all that was possible, first during the war, and then at the start of the revolution, to give the latter the most decisive shape." And, Walter Rathenau, democratic leader, notable thinker of the German bourgeoisie, who, as you will recall, was killed a year ago by a German nationalist in his noteworthy book, The Triple Revolution, puts forth some very interesting opinions about the shape and reach of the German Revolution. Walter Rathenau says, "We call the German Revolution something that was the general strike of a defeated army." Later, Walter Rathenau points out that, while in Russia there was an old revolutionary preparation, in Germany there was no revolutionary preparation at all. The German proletariat lacked revolutionary stimulus. It enjoyed a discreetly comfortable lifestyle. It was able to live with hygiene, with relaxation, with cleanliness. It was even able to save modestly. The state helped large families. In the economic field, the German proletariat had made greater gains than any other proletariat. That is precisely why it had lost interest in conquests in the political field. The Kaiser, the monarchy, reserved for themselves the conduction of the state's foreign and internal policy. This mostly did not bother the proletariat because it did not infringe on any of its immediate interests. Consequently, in the German proletariat there was no true state of revolutionary consciousness. Said differently, this state of consciousness was too embryonic, too nascent, too incipient. Thus the revolution caught the German proletariat unprepared. Naturally, since then, the German proletariat's revolutionary preparation has made strides. Today that preparation is much greater than in 1918. The bourgeois state turns each day further to the right, but the popular masses turn each day further to the left. Each day they show greater revolutionary saturation, consciousness, and preparation. Precisely that separation of the majority socialists from government has occurred under pressure from the masses. For all these reasons, the current German events are but episodes in the German Revolution. The current bourgeois government of Germany is but a period, a chapter, of the German Revolution. The German Revolution has not been consummated because a revolution is not consummated in months nor in years, but, neither has it been aborted, nor has it failed. The German Revolution only begun. We are witnessing its development. A period of bourgeois reaction is a period of bourgeois counter-offensive, but not of definitive proletarian defeat. From this point of view, which is logical, which is fair, which is exact, which is historical, the fascist government, the fascist reaction in Italy, is but an episode, a chapter, a period of the Italian Revolution, of the Italian Civil War. Fascism is in government, but the Italian proletariat has not capitulated, it has not disarmed, it has not surrendered. It prepares for revenge. Meanwhile, in order to get into government, fascism has had to trample the principles of democracy, of parliamentarianism, it has had to undermine the institutional basis of the old order of things, to teach the people that power is seized through violence, to give practical demonstration that it is retained but through dictatorship. And, all this is eminently revolutionary. All this is a service to the revolution's cause. In the next lecture I will deal with the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and with the Hungarian Revolution. I shall then begin the examination of the Versailles Peace, of that peace which has been the failure of Wilson's democratic illusions, and which has left Europe the legacy of this situation. However, this will not be next Friday because next Friday is July 27th, night of fireworks and revelry, but Friday the 4th of August. History of the World Crisis. Lecture 7. The Hungarian Revolution. By J.C. Mariategua. Translated by Juan Arfa Yardo, 1998. Delivered to the González Prada People's University. At the Peruvian Student Federation Hall, Lima, on July 13, 1923. Tonight, we again take up our conversations on the history of the world crisis, which were interrupted by 3 weeks of vacation. We arrive, today, at an interestingly dramatic chapter in the history of the world crisis. The program for this course of lectures tells us the topic, the Hungarian Revolution. Count Károlyi, Béla Kun, Horthy. These three names, Károlyi, Béla Kun, Horthy, summarize the phases of the Hungarian Revolution, the insurrectional and democratic phase, the communist and proletarian phase, the reactionary and terroristic phase. Károlyi was the man of the Hungarian insurrection, Béla Kun was the man of the proletarian revolution, Horthy is the man of the bourgeois reaction, of the white terror and brutal and truculent repression of the proletariat. Here, where the Russian Revolution is poorly known, the Hungarian Revolution is even less well known, and this is understandable. The story of the Russian Revolution is the story of a victorious revolution, while the story of the Hungarian Revolution is, so far, the story of a defeated revolution. The cable has not stopped telling us chilling things about the Russian Revolution and its men, but it has told us almost nothing of the Hungarian reaction and its men. And, the good bourgeois, so concerned about the Red Terror, the Russian Terror, are not concerned at all by the White Terror, by Horthy's dictatorship in Hungary. Nevertheless, there is nothing more bloody, more tragic, than this somber and medieval period of Hungarian life. None of the crimes imputed to the Russian Revolution can compare to the crimes committed by the bourgeois reaction in Hungary. We see, in order, the three phases of the Hungarian Revolution. I have already explained the processes of the German Revolution and of the Austrian Revolution. Good. The process of the Hungarian Revolution is, in broad strokes, the same. But it has always something physiognomical, something particular to itself. Aside from the tiredness, the fatigue, the discontent with the war, the Hungarian Revolution was prepared by the longings for national independence, suddenly awakened, excited, and stimulated by the Wilsonian propaganda. Wilson encouraged peoples against autocracy and against absolutism, and, at the same time, he encouraged them against the foreign yoke. Hungary, as you know, endured domination by the Austrian dynasty of the Habsburgs. The Hungarians, different in race, language, and history, from the Austrians, did not voluntarily coexist with the Hungarians within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Thus, the defeat did not bring only revolution to Austro-Hungary, it also brought about dissolution. The nationalities which made up the Austro-Hungarian Empire became independent and separated. Naturally, the victorious powers stimulated this breakup of Austro-Hungary into several small states. As I have already stated on another occasion, the Austrian front was weakened before the German front precisely because of the separatist ideals of the nationalities which were part of Austro-Hungary and, consequently, the Austrian military front gave way before German military front. Faced with the Italians' victorious offensive in the Piave, the Czechoslovak soldiers and the Hungarian soldiers, tired of the war, spontaneously threw down their weapons and refused to continue fighting. This occurred in the latter part of October, 1918. The front-line troops' rebellion against the war spread quickly to the entire Hungarian army. Thus began the Hungarian Revolution, which, like the German Revolution, was, in Walther Rathenau's words, at first a general strike by a defeated army. Like the German Revolution, the Hungarian Revolution began with the military insurrection, but in Hungary this military insurrection was not followed immediately by a proletarian insurrection. The proletarian movement was still too immature, too incipient. The Hungarian proletariat still lacked a solid revolutionary class consciousness. Count Michael Károlyi headed the first revolutionary government. This government, which emerged from the October 31st insurrection, was a government of the radical bourgeoisie coalitioned with social democracy. Count Károlyi was, in a way, the Hungarian Revolution's Kerensky. but he was a less sectarian, more revolutionary, more interesting, more suggestive, Kerensky. Count Károlyi was an old agitator for Hungarian nationalism. A radical agitator emerged from the Hungarian aristocracy, but infected with the social democratic mentality of his time. An agitator with a romantic temperament, easily inflamed, capable of any bizarre lunacy, and exempt from the mediocre Kerensky's democratic and bourgeois superstitions. The mental and spiritual distance which separates the two figures is rendered more clear and ostensible after their governments than during them. While Kerensky has not stopped orienting toward the Russian capitalists and even toward the monarchists, Károlyi has, with each passing day, evolved further to the left. So much so that about 2 years ago he was expelled from Italy, accused of being a Bolshevik agent. I had the opportunity to meet him in Florence in 1921. In other words, 2.5 years ago. It was on the eve of the famous Socialist Congress of Livorno, at which the Italian Socialist Party would break apart. Cesar Falcon and I awaited the meeting date for the Congress in Florence, which is no more than 4 hours from Livorno. We filled our time visiting Florence's museums, palaces, and churches. I already knew Florence perfectly. I served, thus, as chaperone to Falcon, which visited it for the first time. One day a journalist friend let us know that Count Károlyi was living incognito at a Florence boarding house. Naturally, we immediately resolved to seek him out, but the moment was not a good one for entering into relations with the Hungarian ex-president. The newspapermen had just discovered his presence incognito in Florence and besieged him in order to report on him. Consequently, Count Károlyi avoided interviews from strangers. Nonetheless, Falcon and I managed to speak with him. We chatted extensively about the European situation in general and about the Hungarian situation in particular. In those days 5 Hungarian communists Agosto, Nias, Zgabato, Bolszomji, and Kalmar People's Commissars in Bela Kun's government had been condemned to death by Horthy's government. Károlyi was deeply concerned by this news and, since his incognito had been violated by several journalists, he decided to definitively renounce it in order to start an international public opinion campaign in favor of the former Hungarian People's Commissars condemned to death. He took advantage of all the reports made on him to ask for the intervention of Europe's honest spirits in defense of those noble and heroic lives. He asked Falcon and I to act in this regard on Spanish journalists. In short, at that time, Károlyi made common cause with the Hungarian communists, in the same way that Kerensky made common cause with the Russian capitalists and even monarchists. This anecdotal note helps to delineate, to define, Károlyi's personality, and that is why I have included it in my dissertation. But let us return now to the ordered story of the revolution. Let us examine Károlyi's precarious government. The dissimilarity, the moral difference, between each leader notwithstanding, more or less the same thing happened to Károlyi's government in Hungary as happened to Kerensky's government in Russia. It did not represent the ideals and interests of capitalism, nor did it represent the ideals and interests of the proletariat. The soldiers, back from the front and the war, wanted a bit of land. The widows and orphans of the fallen and the crippled demanded financial relief from the state. Károlyi's government could not satisfy either demand because only at the expense of the bourgeoisie, at the expense of capitalism, could it be possible to meet them. However, these unfulfilled demands grew more acute day by day. The Hungarian proletariat was gaining a revolutionary consciousness. Here and there factory councils sprang up. The proletariat's left wing broke with the collaborationist Social Democrats and formed a communist party led by Bela Kun. This communist party, like the German Spartacists, preached the carrying out of the maximum program. Some factories were taken over by workers. Of course, this mounting revolutionary wave alarmed the reactionary elements to an extreme degree. Capitalism sensed that private ownership of lands and factories was threatened, and quickly and actively organized the reaction. The nobles, the landlords, the military chiefs, in other words, the extreme right prepared to overthrow Károlyi's weak government, which could not count on the proletarian masses, but also did not adequately guarantee capitalism's safety. Simultaneously, the international situation also conspired against Karolyi's government. Those were the days of the armistice and the birth of peace. The Allied powers were opposed to the creation of a strong Hungary, or rather, were interested in that Yugoslavia, on the one hand, and Czechoslovakia, on the other, grow strong at Hungary's expense. The nationalist elements demanded from Karolyi a policy of energetically pressing claims. Each loss of territory by Karolyi in the international arena, meant a loss of territory in the terrain of internal politics. And, there came a fatal day for Karolyi's government. The Allied governments notified him, by way of Lieutenant Colonel Vyx, that the then borders of Hungary should be considered permanent. These borders meant the loss of enormous tracts for Hungary. Karolyi could not submit to these conditions. If he had, a chauvinist revolt would have brought him down in a few days. Thus, he had no option left but resignation, stepping down from power, which was immediately seized by the proletariat. Frequently, Karolyi has been accused of handing the government over to the working class. In reality, however, events were greater than Karolyi's will and to any individual will. From one side, the reactionary wave, and from the other, the revolutionary wave, both threatened Karolyi's government, which was, consequently, doomed to disappear, swallowed by one or the other. The reaction and the revolution both prepared for the assault at the same time. And, well, it was the revolution's hour. Having been opened by Karolyi, the revolutionary period had to reach its maximum height, to reach fullness, before starting to decline. And, when Karolyi resigned, the proletariat hurried to take power into its own hands in order to prevent its being mastered by the most retrograde nobilities and bourgeoisie's reaction. Thus emerged the government of Bela Kun. On March 21, 1919, or more or less 5 months after the constitution of Karolyi's government, the Revolutionary Government Council of the Soviet Hungarian Republic was formed. Communists and Social Democrats joined in the creation of this revolutionary government. And, this is the sign which sets the Hungarian Communist Revolution apart from the Russian Communist Revolution. In Russia, the dictatorship of the proletariat was taken up exclusively by the Maximalist Party, with the benevolent neutrality of the left social revolutionaries, but with the right social revolutionaries and the Mensheviks' opposition. In Hungary, by contrast, the dictatorship of the proletariat was exercised by communists and social democrats jointly. Apparently, this gave the Hungarian workers' government strength because, by virtue of the agreement between communists and social democrats, that workers' government represented the unanimity of the proletariat. Unanimity, +1. All the great proletarian tendencies in power, but this was also the Hungarian Soviet Republic's weakness. The Social Democratic Party lacked sufficient revolutionary consciousness. Its leading body was made up of reformist elements, mentally and spiritually averse to maximalism. These elements came from the union bureaucracy. They were old union organizers, grown old in the minimalist and contingent action of union life, superstitiously respectful of the bourgeoisie's strength, deprived of the capacity and will to solidariously collaborate with the maximalists, whom they dismissed as young, inexperienced, and extremist. Why then, did the Hungarian Social Democrats cooperate with, and decisively participate in the revolution? The explanation lies in Hungary's political situation under Karolyi's government, which I have described earlier. Karolyi's government, in which the Social Democrats participated, was unremittably condemned to fall crushed by the revolution or by the reaction. The Social Democrats found themselves, then, in need of choosing between the communist revolution and the feudal and aristocratic reaction. Of course, they had to opt for the communist revolution. Moreover, they had to hurry it along in order to eliminate the danger of the reactions gaining time. When Karolyi resigned, the directorate of the Communist Party was in jail. The Social Democrats and the Communist leaders negotiated and agreed amongst themselves, but the former from the seat of power and the latter from prison. Around the communist leaders was the majority of the masses, committed to revolution. The Social Democrats did not give in, then, in the face of the communist leaders, they gave in the face of the majority of the proletariat. Their capitulation was, on the face of it, complete. The Social Democrats accepted, in its entirety, the carrying out of the communist program. But they accepted without conviction, without faith, without true moral or mental adherence to it. They accepted it constrained, pushed, pressed upon, by the circumstances. In exchange for the adherence to the communists' program, they demanded only the right to participate in its realization. They told the communists, "We accept your program, but we want to take part in the government destined to carry it out." It was a logical demand. It was a natural demand. And, it was a legitimate demand. The communists agreed to it. That was their first mistake, because, by virtue of the character of the Social Democratic Communist Alliance, Hungary's Soviet government turned out to be a hybrid government, a mixed government, a compound government. This workers' government's program of a uniform hue, but the men charged with carrying it out were of two different hues. One part of the government truly wanted the carrying out of the program and sensed its historical necessity. Another part of the government did not intimately believe in the possibility of bringing about that program. It had accepted it with clenched teeth, without optimism and without confidence. The Social Democrats, in their majority, saw in the general European revolution the only hope of salvation for the Hungarian proletarian revolution. They lacked the intellectual and spiritual preparation to defend the Hungarian proletarian revolution, even in the event that the proletariat of the great European powers not answer the call, the incitement, of the Russian Revolution. This is the spiritual cause, the moral cause, for the end of the dictatorship of the proletariat in Hungary. In spite of the Social Democrats' deft sabotage, in its brief months of existence Belakun's government developed, to a great extent, the proletariat's economic and social program. It proceeded to the expropriation of the latifundia and landed estates, of the means of production and industrial establishments. The latifundia and the landed estates, the old property of the Hungarian aristocracy, were given to the peasants, organized into production cooperatives. At the same time, the war's victims whose demands were not able to be met by the government of Karolyi, impeded by its views and respect for the capitalist order, were solicitously tended to. The invalid, the mutilated, widows, orphans, and the unemployed were succored. The luxury sanatoriums were turned into hospitals for the people. The aristocrats' palaces, castles, and chalets were turned to the lodging of the invalid, of the aged, or of sick proletarian children. Simultaneously, public education and general culture were reorganized on a class basis, revolutionarily, in order to turn them into instruments of socialist education. And, so that culture, technical ability, once the exclusive patrimony of the bourgeoisie, would be socialized to the benefit the proletariat. But, against Belakun's government there conspired, on the one hand, the Social Democrats' skepticism and resistance, and on the other, the predations of the victorious powers. The capitalist powers saw in Soviet Hungary a dangerous focus for the propagandization of the communist idea. And, they took pains to eliminate it, pushing the neighboring nations under the victorious Entente's tutelage against the Hungarian Republic. In the meantime, the Social Democrats limited and blocked the government's measures against the reactionary preparations and plots. Ensconced within their democratic and liberal prejudices, in their superstition of freedom, the Social Democrats did not allow government to suspend individual liberties for the aristocrats, bourgeois, and conspiratorial military men. Belakun's Minister of Justice was a Social Democrat. A Social Democrat who seemed more worried about protecting the freedom of counter-revolutionary elements than with defending the revolution's existence. The Hungarian Revolution was thus attacked on two fronts, the external front and the internal front. Externally, it was threatened by the counter-revolutionary intervention of the Allied powers, who economically blockaded Hungary in order to besiege it with hunger. Internally, it was threatened by social democracy's revolutionary unpreparedness, the revolutionary inconstance of one of the bases, one of the fundamental supports of the revolutions, one of the two governing parties. It was under these conditions that Belacon's government, inaugurated on the 21 of March, reached the middle of April. It was toward mid-April that Romania, one of the Entente's pawns in this great political match, invaded Hungary. The Romanian troops took hold of Hungary's best agricultural zone, and they advanced toward the Tibasco River, threatening Budapest. The moment was critical. On the 2 of May, Belacon explained the situation in a dramatic session of the Budapest Workers' Council. He posed the following question: was it preferable to organize resistance, or was it preferable to surrender to the Allied powers? Many Social Democrats spoke in favor of the latter thesis, but the Workers' Council stuck by Belacon's thesis. It was necessary to resist to the very end. There was alternative but the revolution's complete victory or complete defeat. No middle position was possible. To give in to the capitalist powers would to totally renounce the revolution and its conquests. The Workers' Council voted for resistance at all costs, and the government got to work. The workers of Budapest's factories, the vanguard of the Hungarian proletariat, constituted a great Red Army which stopped the Romanians' offensive and inflicted a total defeat upon the Czechoslovakians. The Hungarian revolutionaries penetrated into Czechoslovakia, occupying a great portion of the Czech territory. The moment was turning critical for the Allied offensive against Societe Hungary. Revolutionary seeds were spreading within the Czech army. The astute capital seat diplomacy then changed tactics. The Allied powers invited Hungary to withdraw the Red Army from Czech territory, offering the withdrawal of the Romanian army from occupied territory beyond the Tibasco River as compensation. The Social Democrats spoke out for the acceptance of this proposal and took advantage of the unpopularity of the carrying out the war within the spirits of the proletariat, worn down after 5 years of war-related travails. The Communists could not energetically counteract this propaganda. The Communist Party's most numerous and combative elements were absent from Budapest, having voluntarily enrolled in the Red Army. The vanguard of the Budapest proletariat was at the front, battling against the revolution's external enemies. Under the influence of Budapest's social democratic atmosphere, the government and the Council of Soviets thus ended up leaning toward the Allied proposal. The Red Army, unhappy and depressed in its combative will, withdrew from Czechoslovakia. But, its sacrifice was for naught, as the Allied powers did not, for their part, keep their agreement. The Romanians did not withdraw from Hungarian territory. This deception, this failure, greatly disheartened the Hungarian proletariat, whose revolutionary faith was sapped, on the other hand, by the defeatist propaganda of the Social Democrats, who began to secretly work out a negotiated solution with the Allied powers' diplomatic representatives. The reaction, in the meantime, readied itself to seize power. On the 24th of June, reactionary elements, joined by 300 students from the former military academy, took control of the Danube's lookouts. This sedition was put down, but the revolutionary tribunals treated the rebels with excessive generosity. The 300 rebel student officers were pardoned. 13 instigators and organizers of the insurrection were sentenced to death, but, giving in to pressure from the Allied diplomatic missions, they too ended up being released. The communist regime, in the meantime, kept on struggling against enormous difficulties. Provisions were scarce due, on the one hand, to the blockade, and on the other, to the Romanian occupation of the Tibasco's fertile agricultural region. The available foodstuffs did not suffice to supply the entire populace. This scarcity contributed to creating an air of discontent and distrust toward the communist regime. Belacon's government then decided to attempt an offensive against the Romanians in order to dislodge them from the lands beyond the Tibasco. But this offensive, begun on July 20, did not succeed. The Red Army, disheartened by so many disappointments, was repulsed and defeated by the Romanian army. This military setback condemned the communist regime to death. The Social Democratic and Union leaders entered into formal peace talks with Allied diplomatic missions. These missions promised recognition for a social democratic government. In sum, they put the elimination of the communists and the destruction of their work as the price of peace. The Social Democratic Party and the unions, with the illusion that a social democratic government protected by the Allied diplomatic missions could hold on to power, accepted the Entente's conditions. Thus fell the government of Bellicon. On August 2, the Council of People's Commissars abdicated command. It was replaced by a social democratic government. This social democratic government, in order to contain and satisfy the Allied powers, repealed the communist government's laws. It re-established private property of factories, latifundia, and landed estates. It re-established freedom of trade and returned the bourgeois administration's functionaries and employees to their posts. In short, it re-established the capitalist order. But, with all that, this social democratic government lasted but 3 days. With the defeat of the revolution, power inevitably had to fall into the reaction's hands, and so it was. The social democratic government lasted but the time necessary for the abolition of communist legislation and for the aristocracy, militarism, and capitalism to organize the attempt to seize of power. The Social Democrats were unable to resist the reactionary wave. They could not even count on the no longer fooled masses of the democratic government from its first moment of life, since it undertook the destruction of the revolution's work. They had to fall at the reactionaries' first onslaught. Thus ended the communist regime in Hungary. Thus was born the reactionary regime of Admiral Horthy. Thus began the Hungarian proletariat's martyrdom. Never was a proletarian revolution punished so cruelly, so brutally repressed. Horthy's government lent itself, body and soul, to the persecution of all those citizens who had participated in the communist administration. The White Terror struck Hungary like a terrible whip. It turned first against the communists, then on the Social Democrats, and later on against the Hebrews, Masons, Protestants, and finally against even the bourgeois suspected of excessive liberal and democratic devotion. But it threw itself, above all, against the proletariat. The cities and towns guilty of revolutionary enthusiasm under the communist government were horrifically punished. In the regions beyond the Danube some locales, marked by their communist sentiment, were truly depopulated. Innumerable workers were shot or massacred, others were jailed, and others forced to emigrate to escape the analogous punishments or constant mistreatments. Every day, there arrived in Austria, in Italy, numerous contingents of escapees, armies of workers who left Hungary fleeing from the White Terror. Vienna was full of Hungarian refugees. And in almost all the main Italian cities through which I traveled at that time, the Hungarian refugees were also legion. All description of the White Terror in Hungary will always pale in comparison with reality. From August 1919, in Hungary there have followed shootings, drawing and quartering, jailings, arson, mutilations, looting, as means of repression and punishment of the proletariat. It has been necessary that the reactionaries thirst for blood ease and that a cry of horror from civilized men of Europe still it, for the crimes and persecutions diminish and become rare. I have on hand a book which contains some tales of the White Terror in Hungary. Reads from book. But these tales could seem exaggerated to the bourgeois hearts. It will be said that this is an Italian version and that the Italians are always, as good Italians, excessive and passionate in their impressions. But it happens that the same things, more or less, have been told by a commission of the trade unions and the English Labour Party, which visited Hungary in May 1920, to directly find out what was happening there. The British Commission's finding is one of executed circumspection, and, even more, it is the finding of a commission of very measured, very grave, and very conscientious people from the trade unions and the Labour Party. The English delegation was made up of Colonel Wedgwood, member of the House of Commons, and 4 distinguished members of the trade unions and Labour Party's bureaucracy. Naturally, the delegation could not visit all of Hungary. It visited but Budapest and one or another important township. During its visit, moreover, there was a prudent truce of the White Terror. Horthy's reactionary government tried to cover things up as much as possible. The delegation's means of information were, in short, limited and insufficient for learning the true magnitude, the true reality of the terrorism of Horthy's bands. Consequently, the English Commission's finding is but a pale, a benevolent, narration of Hungarian events. It sins in moderation, in optimism, but it nonetheless corroborates the affirmations of the book from which I have just read a page. According to the Commission's calculations, at the time at which it was in Hungary, the number of political prisoners and detainees was at least 12,000. According to official information there were 6,000. Horthy's government was admitting that it had 6,000 people imprisoned for political reasons. In its report, the Komisszion tells that it had been assured that the total number of people arrested or detained was above 25,000. The British Commission's report contains severe atrocious anecdotes of the White Terror in Hungary. I will read one of them so that you will be able to form an idea of the ferocity with which the members and functionaries of the communist government, and even their relatives, were persecuted. Such is the case of Mrs. Hamburger. The Commission's report says thusly. Reads from report. Why continue? You already know how the Red Terror behaved in Hungary. You already know many things which have been told to us by the newspapers' cablegrams, so prodigal in horrific details when it comes to narrating a death by firing squad in Soviet Russia. Horthy's government resembles a frightening mission from the Middle Ages. It is not in vain that its characteristics are, precisely, those of attempting to re-establish medievalism and feudalism in Hungary. The reaction in Hungary is not only the enemy of socialism and the revolutionary proletariat. It is also the enemy of industrial capitalism. Because industrial capitalism, the factories and large industry give rise to the industrial proletariat, the organized proletariat in the city that is, the instrument of social revolution. The Hungarian reaction instinctively detests industrial capitalism, the large factories, large industry. Horthy's government is the despotic and bloodthirsty rule of agricultural feudalism, of the landlords and latifundists. Horthy governs Hungary with the title of regent because for the reaction Hungary continues to be a kingdom. A kingdom without a king, but a kingdom still. A year and a half ago, as you will remember, Charles of Austria, ex-emperor of Austro-Hungary, son of Franz Joseph, was called on by the Hungarian monarchists to re-establish the monarchy in Hungary. The plan failed because the re-establishment of the Habsburg dynasty, of the old ruling house of Austro-Hungary, was opposed by all the nations made independent as a result of the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who feared that, once installed in Hungary, the monarchy would end up establishing the old empire. It failed, also, because Italy, alarmed at the possibility of the rebirth of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, opposed the re-establishment of the monarchy in Hungary for the same reasons. All these nations opposed their veto to placing Charles back on the throne in Hungary. Lastly, against this resumption were the non-aristocratic peasants, opposed to socialism but equally opposed to the old order. That is why today we do not have a Hungary transformed into an absolute, medieval, and feudal, monarchy with a king at the head. But, in fact, the regime of Regent Horthy is an absolute, medieval, and feudal regime. It is the domination of the great estates over Sutri, the domination of the countryside over the city. As a result of this regime, Hungary is impoverished. Its depreciate money lacks hope of convalescence and stabilization. The poverty of the intellectual and manual proletariat is apocalyptic. A journalist told me in Budapest, in June of last year, that in this city there were people who could eat only every other day, one day yes, one day no. This poor journalist, who no doubt was a privileged being next to other intellectual workers, seemed afflicted by hunger and misery. I later met an intellectual, the author of several studies on musical aesthetics, who served as doorman in a house in the neighborhood. Poverty had forced him to accept the role of doorman. Such is the economic order, the consequences of the reaction and White Terror. But a period of reaction, a period of absolutism, cannot be but a transitory, temporary period. A contemporary nation, and much less an European nation, cannot return to primitive and barbarian way of life. A resurrection of feudalism and medievalism cannot be long-lasting. The necessities of modern life, the tendency of the productive forces, the relation with other nations, do not allow the regression by a people to an anti-industrial nor anti-proletarian order. Gradually, the proletarian movement is reviving in Hungary. The Social Democratic Party and the unions again win their right to a legal existence. Into the Hungarian parliament have gone some socialist deputies, but timidly socialist in the end. The Communist Party, condemned to an illegal and clandestine life, silently prepares the hour of its re-emergence. Some democratic or liberal elements of the bourgeoisie also begin to move and polarize. Fearful of this rebirth of proletarian forces and of democratic forces, a fascist band has been organized in Hungary. Its headman is the famous reactionary Friedrich. It is all symptomatic. As I have already said about the German Revolution, a revolution is not a coup d'état, it is not an insurrection, it is not one of those things which we here call a revolution from arbitrary use of the word. A revolution does not take place but over many years, and frequently it has alternating periods of predominance by revolutionary forces and of predominance by counter-revolutionary forces. Just as a war is a process of offensives and counter-offensives, of victories and defeats, while one of the combatant groups does not definitively capitulate, while it does not give up its struggle, it is not defeated. Its defeat is transitory, but not total. In accordance with this interpretation of history, the reaction, the White Terror, Horthy's government, are but an unpleasant chapter of the Hungarian Revolution. This chapter will someday come to its final page. Then, there will begin another chapter, a chapter which may be the chapter of the Hungarian proletariat's victory. Horthy's government is, for the Hungarian proletariat, a dark night, a painful nightmare. But this dark night, this painful nightmare, will pass. Then will come the dawn. Next Friday, in accordance with the program of this course of lectures, I will talk about the conference and the Treaty of the Versailles Peace. I will give the history, explanation, and critique of that peace treaty which, as you know, has not resulted in a treaty for peace but a treaty for war. I will lay out the moral physiognomy, the ideological profile, of that document, still fresh, and already totally discredited, grave and headstone for President Wilson's candid democratic illusions. History of the World Crisis. Lecture 8. Germany's Current Political Situation. By J.C. Mariategua. Translated by Juan Arfa-Yardo, 1998. Delivered to the González Prada People's University. At the Peruvian Student Federation Hall, Lima, on July 13, 1923. For some reason Mariategua changed the program for the evening and delivered the lecture on German politics, the notes for which appear below, and postponed the planned talk on the Treaty of Versailles until the following week. Trans. Author's notes. The major German political groups are, Pan-Germanists, Populists, Catholics, Democrats, Socialists, Communists. Consul Organization, Eschrich Organization, Hitler and Ludendorff's Bavarian Fascism. Antecedents to the present situation, the fall of Wirth's cabinet. The formation of the Cuno cabinet. The return of Hugo Stin's populists to government. The socialists' position on this government. The effects of the occupation of the Ruhr on German politics. The current German crisis is but the exasperation of the political crisis brought about by social democracy's collaboration with the bourgeoisie. Cuno's resignation. Streseman's cabinet. Minister of Finance Hilferding. Rhenish separatism. Smeets and Dorton's separatist factions. Their agitation and coming fusion. France's promotion of it. The occupation of the Ruhr's consequences on the German economy. The catastrophe of the mark. the impossibility that mutilated, fractured Germany reorganize itself. A nation is a living organism. It is not possible to wound it without altering, without disordering its functioning. The occupation of the Ruhr condemns Germany to ruin, to misery. But, a ruined Germany means a worsening of the European economic crisis. Moribund nations, starving nations cannot coexist with nations filled with vitality, plethoric nations. The world's economic organism has become too solidarious for this to occur. A nation that is primitive, insignificant, and little evolved economically can descend into misery without visibly affecting the other nations of the continent. But a nation with so complex and so vast an international dynamism cannot be brought down and destroyed without mortal damage to its neighbors. The problems of peace have uncovered the solidarity between victors and the defeated which prevents the former from crushing the latter. The true causes of the occupation of the Ruhr. The chauvinists, the nationalists desire the annihilation of Germany. They have the nightmare of German reconstruction, of German revenge. The metallurgists aspire to possess German coal. The metallurgists' press exploits the patriotism of the petit bourgeois classes. The National Bloc, the Left Bloc, and the Communists. Stin's program, suppression of the 8-hour workday, reduction of state personnel, handing over of the railways to private enterprise. In a word, the abolition, the derogation of all the conquests of the socialist minimum program. A bourgeois coalition lacks the strength to act on this plan. The dissension within social democracy. The left tendency and the right tendency. The fear of communist participation. The policies of the German communists, De Kussig, Stocker. The factory councils. The Proletarian United Front. The workers' government. The nationalization of 51% of the businesses, under the workers' control. The Social Democrats and their apprehensions and fears. The nationalist phenomenon. The penury middle and petit bourgeois. The poverty of the intellectuals. Radek proposes that fascism be fought not only with arms but also with political weapons. The middle class, dominated by the memory of its past well-being, leans toward a re-establishment of the old order. It lacks a class mentality, class consciousness. A government of the middle class cannot but carry out capitalist policies. The middle class needs to join either the capitalist class or the salaried class. It has no room for a middle or independent position. Which are the present hour's perspectives? An immediate rectification of French policies is not probable. Occupation of the Ruhr will, therefore, continue to disorganize, impoverish, and ruining Germany. There is talk of the possibility that German and French industrialists coordinate and make an arrangement. This alliance of French capitalism with German capitalism would be made only at the expense of the working class. There already have been preludes of intelligence of this nature, the Löcher-Lübbersack Agreement. This intelligence would disquiet England. German industry and French industry would constitute a formidable continental bloc. Likewise, there is talk of England proposing the formation of an Anglo-Franco-German conglomerate. Lastly, Mussolini dreams of a continental bloc, Germany, France, and Italy. But these projects stumble over the difficulty of nationalist egoisms. Each power longs for an alliance in which it gets the lion's share. The climate left by the war is a noxious and asphyxiating climate. It is poisoned by hates, rancors, and egoistic passions. The reasoning that common sense and common interests will prevail in the mentality of the various European capitalist groups is a reasoning which ignores the dark and mysterious, but decisive, influence which psychological factors have on the march of history. History of the World Crisis. Lecture 8. Germany's Current Political Situation. By J.C. Mariategua. Translated by Juan Arfa Yardo, 1998. Delivered to the González Prada People's University. At the Peruvian Student Federation Hall, Lima, on July 13, 1923.